tubes and blah, blah, and the clavier, and then like things just get streamlined down by. Yeah, but I missed the poetry of the clunky old DAOs and the staking gen to have a proposal show up for things like that.
Yeah, I think I can resonate with that. I mean, I feel like we were building a bunch of tools because we didn't have DAOs, you know, so we were building a bunch of tech and contracts and things that were like, we're going to do this. But now we're like, oh, we've seen humans coordinating for years now in DAOs and things. So now I feel like we're in a place where we're like, oh, now we need these tools, you know, and like we're not, well, but to your point, currently, like a lot of organizations are still defined by the tools that they use. You know, like you have an organization, people getting together to do a thing, and they're like, let's use this tool, but now that tool redefines the organization, right? So like, and if we have simple tools and like this is working, it's treasury management, it's a token or whatever, then like that can very quickly and easily like redesign your organization, whether or not you're aware of that or not. So that's kind of where we are, and then, but now we're kind of like, oh, now we need these new tools. So now because we're actually seeing like what we actually need, you know. So I feel like that's kind of where we're at now, which is really exciting. Like there's tools popping up out of communities, out of like actual need, you know, and like, oh, we actually need to do this thing, to do this thing, to do this thing. Let's build 5 tools and see which one actually does it, or whatever, you know.
In some sense, I would also say that, first off, before we get too nostalgic about creaky old DAOs, I feel like current DAOs are also still pretty creaky. So, you know, let's save this nostalgia for like 5 years.
People are voting on Discord and calling it a DAO, Josh.
What?
People are voting on Discord and calling it a DAO, and then organizing an event saying that they're going to build 10 million DAOs and that they're industry leaders, and they're just like voting on Discord. Like it's real. It's happening.
Mean, I'll be totally honest. Like, I've had conversations with like 10 different DAO. How do I say it? In a lot of cases, actually, like having a Discord and voting on it and not having a smart contract is actually what I would like advise people do. Like, you may be wanting to start a DAO, and like you want to start a smart contract, build a protocol, or whatever it is you want to build. Start with a Discord. Don't start with, you know, a contract before you just have any idea what you're doing.
Start with the humans. What are the humans doing? What can we do better? Yeah.
So yeah, I would just say like the cocoon Discord stage of a DAO is actually really important, and you should not avoid it. You should lean into it. What was I going to say before Felipe distracted me? I would say that one evolution over one thing that I've seen, at least, is that communities actually know how to use the tools better. So if you look at things like, you know, SourceCred, which is like a really complicated tool, or even like CoreNape, right? You know, it takes a little bit of culture and experimentation to know how to use these things best. And there are actually sometimes like creative ways of applying it, and different communities use things like SourceCred very differently. Some of them use them well, I think like Metagame, and some of them don't use them so well, like SourceCred itself, actually, which is kind of a funny story, but maybe a separate time.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. So I'm part of a DAO called Metagamma Delta, and we definitely, one of our missions is to onboard women into Web3 and support them through funding and ecosystem support. But a lot of like some of the challenges that we faced in the early days was definitely like how to use the tooling that we've adopted. So we launched on DAO House, and it takes some like onboarding efforts to get them to learn how to use the tools. So that definitely resonates with, you know, simplicity first. Although we started as a Moloch DAO, and then just, you know, community members, if they're like motivated to learn, then they'll learn how to use the tools themselves. But I was wondering, like, do you have like stories or examples of DAOs that started off adopting these more simplistic, more off-chain type tools, and then gradually started adopting more DAO native, or what you would consider DAO native tools as they grew?
Yeah, like we are one of them. We have, I guess, 2 ways of governance. We have one is Discord voting, which is the main what we use right now. And now we have a separate funding DAO that's like we submit proposals to it to get funding for monthly proposals. And I think with Discord voting, it's still like, it's weird because it's like, to be honest, nobody really knows what are DAOs, like what is the actual definition of a DAO, because some DAOs may be using Discord to vote, but they still may be more DAOs than some DAOs who are like, oh yeah, we use Aragon, but we have 2 whales that control like half of the token supply, and so like, which one is more of a DAO? I don't know.
No, that's a good question. But so I agree with what Josh stated that the pre-DAO stage is important, but maybe not necessarily a but you still need to eventually DAO, and so there are communities in DAOs that do not necessarily rely on the pressure of automated contract resolution of the things to make decisions. So the DAO is just a system, like a place to keep the money. People mostly agree socially, and then you just use a DAO to execute something. Those are DAOs. I'm not criticizing them. It's fine. It's normal in the Moloch ecosystem. I just miss the collective intelligence that's born out of political strife that's given by the actual consequence of an automated result. So people really go at it, right? So you really get rid of the principal problem, especially when you don't have token voting and whales and there's a wide distribution of power. And I saw what that does, and I don't see that happening so often anymore because we are settling for these streamlined, more social systems. And I'm not saying that they're not DAOs, I'm not saying that they're bad, but I think we're still like need to make headways to have these places where people that are not intimate, do not trust each other, heavily disagree, are collectively managing funds. I think that's the fun of this for me personally. So like I can, it's not an announcement, I need to approve this via DAO. But as soon as we finish the Dawn sponsorship structure, I wouldn't call it a raise because we're selling sponsorships, but there's a funding goal that's going to be achieved. Once that is achieved, I want to launch a DAO that works like this, that we haven't had for a long time since Genesis, which is going to be called Day. So that's, in case you didn't see where Dawn was going, there's going to be Day. Day will come, and then they will control funds directly, and it will have no stated goal at all. It'll be a honeypot for people to fucking come and do shit with. And who? People who have governance in the DAOist. Like how much governance the NFT structure is going to translate in today? Is it going to be the same or not? I don't know. We're going to find out via Dawn. So Dawn is the political engine. Day is the money printing machine. And we can play with these systems. We can create like differing political bodies that are controlled by different subsets of a community. So if I stand for something, is political imagination, right? So it's nice that we, as friends, can control a bank with a thing, and then we do the thing, and the thing does the thing. But that is not taking us towards finding out what is the next level of coordination throughput as humanity, right? So we still, I mean, I read that last Bankless newsletter, and I don't necessarily, I don't know if it was the last time I was able to read something about like Ethereum Empire, blah, blah. I mean, if you know me, of course, my first reaction was repugnance, but I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about it. The only conclusion I have is, one, as a coordination technology, we all are still addicted to empire, which means that we still depend on standing armies at the edges to allow us to be in such ridiculous abundance as we are here in Amsterdam. Ethereum Foundation, like, Amsterdam is cool, but I think we fucked up doing this here. We need to go to other places. We need to be slightly uncomfortable. And we're still addicted to empire in a heavy way. And if DAOs are not pushing us towards something, the next version of like global humanity level coordination throughput that doesn't depend on standing armies and heavy oppression for it to work, like, well, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing here really, right? So this is kind of my inner pressure in my heart. So I just want to throw that out there and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, plus one though, I mean, I think that's really integral to what's part of the design problem of DAOs, I think, is like, it is a movement. You know, there's a much, much deeper thing happening than us sending a bunch of money around the world, you know? In what percentages are we sending the money, and to who? It's like, who cares? That's like not even what's really happening here. There's like so much more emergence happening when we do actually coordinate in this process, and that's kind of like what we're learning now, is like, what is all that? Why are we cooperating as humans? Why are we not cooperating as humans, and how can we do that more? Sure, we can use the tools to do that sometimes, use the right tool for the right job, whatever, but there's a much deeper thing here, egregore, that we're trying to figure out is literally everyone on the planet, where are we going? You know, and I definitely think DAOs it's an exploration into that. You know, I really like where you were going with that. Like, it's a group exploration together. Like, we don't know where we're going, and I think we need to be okay with that and happy with that journey, and just realize that we're on this journey together, and we'll get there. But yeah, it's a movement.
On the question that Felipe posed, I guess I would just say that questions of global governance occur at a like just unimaginably different scale from the scales that like current DAOs exist, right? And actually, I was talking to like a couple of climate change scientists just a few days ago on like how can we apply some of the tooling, or at least the thinking that's going on in this space, to questions that arise and challenges of global governance. But like, I mean, the reality in let's just like focus on climate change, right? Is that, you know, you have like these national sovereignties that you need to be like working with a bunch of like regulatory authorities at international and national scales, like giant corporations. It's just like a very different problem than the one we're facing, where it's like, you know, relatively like mostly individuals. We're just barely getting to like DAO relationships, right? So just like noting the differences and being cognizant of them while being, you know, retaining our optimism, I think is important. That some of the work that we're doing here could and should eventually be applied to these other problems. On the question, I think, that was originally posed around online communities transitioning into DAOs, I was just like, I mean, maybe like use that phrasing or that. Think of all the online communities that already exist, and just imagine like actually all of them could also be DAOs, right? For whatever reason, maybe they need to have a wallet or treasury, or they need to do something like really secure that's on a contract. And then there's a very legit, you know, argument you can make that, oh, maybe you should do like something on the blockchain, do something DAOish. And one of the things, for example, that we're exploring right now, I think Kash is running around somewhere here, but like there are folks from GitHub at DevConnect, and one of the things we're trying to figure out is how can we convert, you know, we have the standard pattern of Discord DAOs. What if we had like standard pattern of GitHub DAOs? So for every repo, open source repo, you could convert that into a DAO. So there's a kind of like a pathway, or different pathways you could imagine, where people begin something that's off-chain and then transition to something that's on-chain.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, from the first kind of generation, that DAO tooling that I've interacted with, and comparing that to the more recent generation, it's like the first set of DAO tools were, like, you can't really think of their equivalents in the Web 2 world, whereas like the more recent generation, there's like a decentralized X, you know, and the X is, you know, Notion or Trello and things like that. And part of that, the thing that drove that emergence was the fact that people are trying to understand DAOs, but the old generation of DAO tooling was just like hard for them to grasp or onboard onto or whatever. So that kind of drove this emergence of things that are more, that feels more familiar to them, right? So I was wondering, like, if we, like, I think that was one of the main reasons why we've now kind of reverted back to this simplicity of like having more familiar tooling to what they're used to in the Web 2 world. But again, if we're not like careful, then we'll just be kind of, we'll just have the same old tools, but with a wallet integration, right? So I guess my question is, like, what do you think it takes for communities to kind of check themselves to not fall into that trap and kind of like realize that, oh, maybe it's time to explore more like truly decentralized ways to govern things, rather than just be their own kind of empire and centralized communities that are just using Web 2.5 tools.
No, it's not a polemic answer. It's just that I've become a little bit allergic to certain words like community, organization, DAO. Wait for it. So, for example, I understand so language is the exercise of drawing lines in the sand, right? If I say B, you hear minus A most of the time. And it's slightly troublesome. So I understand, for example, that Josh needed to say, there's all these bodies, these organizations, and they can be DAOs, right? And they could. But also they don't have to be. They can operate DAOs without becoming DAOs. So all of these big protocols that are saying, oh, we're becoming a DAO now. I'm just enjoying watching them suffer. Because that's not the point. Just the 5 people who care about starting a DAO, start the fucking DAO. And then convince somebody to put $50,000 inside of it and see what the fuck happens. The excessive amount of planning, debate, coordination that people go through to try to get to everyone to agree to do something that is inherently untested and probably stupid is annoying. Just fucking do one thing. Take the inevitable next step. Stop debating shit. Stop spending millions of dollars in these like large protocol proposals. Get the 5 people who get it. Start the DAO. People will come. They will do stuff. It's very simple. The tools are out there. So what we don't know as DAOists mostly is to operate in the DAO way, which is find your personal ignition, execute it without asking for permission. Give yourself permission to decide what comes next. See what happens. Allow your experiment to fail, right? Allow your experiment to grow through that failure and understand that the one DAO doesn't really matter. The only thing that really matters is the DAOists and the people that are born and ignited in the fire of that experimental furnace. And just keep doing that forever until something manifests, right? It's how we did Web 2 too. We did company. One thing eventually. Yeah, so that would be my sort of simplistic, nervous, pseudo-revolutionary South American claim that like instead of trying to transpose the entire organization into a decentralized state, just get the 5 people who get it and do a thing. That will probably take us further, faster, more emergently, fractally, responsibly, elegantly, than just using persuasion and charisma and political power to make assumptions about the unknowable unknowns of what decentralization is going to feel like. Like, I feel like phenomenological, action-based, hyper-aware practitioners will thrive in this space. And I'm trying to create sort of the language to form more of those. And the best idea I had so far is to build a pottery studio in the DAOist house. Because if you know how to center clay, you're gonna get it. So this, I'm just trying to be provocative a little bit because it's a long ass panel. Like it's.
So I would maybe point out that DAOs are not necessarily decentralized. And when large protocols and large companies, sorry, what? Decentralizing. Well, there's lots of issues in the language in this space, but so when large protocols talk about DAOifying, or even like quote unquote Web 2 companies, they're a lot of times, it's because of SEC regulation, right? And it's actually kind of interesting because the SEC doesn't care if you're a DAO, but they do care if you're decentralized or there's like not a central authority, which is actually quite interesting, right? So they need you to be functionally decentralized. So when these large protocols talk about DAOification, that's kind of what they mean, right? They actually mean decentralized in that sense, which comes with all sorts of problems and interesting issues. And I think it's actually really an interesting source of experiments. But when we talk about like DAOs as when I think about DAOs, we're talking about like research around DAOs. it doesn't always mean decentralized. I mean, it does involve a blockchain, which is, hypothetically decentralized. But otherwise, DAOs can be as centralized as you like. They can literally just have one person with all the voting power. Those are like boundary cases that do exist, and that are actually, I mean, if you look at them, they're actually like legit DAOs as well. But just to kind of like denote these like separation and why like there's sometimes a confusion when like one person or one set of people talk about DAOs and other people talk about DAOification or decentralization.
Keep going.
I'm done.
No, I'm really curious to like listen to your experience working with these bigger things, because we are like at the end of the super tiny ones, and just listening to your experience going for like the deep research, like institutional world is super interesting.
Well, thank you for putting me on the spot. So let me think.
You don't have to comply.
Well, to be quite honest, it's like a lot of this, like my experience with it is just like through like research as opposed to like directly interacting with the like large DAOs and their decision making, though I'm like seen some of it. Once again, a lot of it just comes down to like legal pressures for decentralization. And on the sort of subject of decentralization itself, or let's say progressive decentralization, I mean, there's lots of talk about it. I think there's very unclear whether there are, how do I say it? The rails are still being built, essentially, right? There's not that many great examples. A lot of the good examples I think we have of like quote unquote truly successful like decentralized protocols kind of started out like as decentralized. And the ones that, I mean, there's really relatively few cases, I think, of successful transitions or like complete transitions into decentralization. Like, for example, like Algorand has been talking about this since forever. Not exactly a DAO, but and I've been like, what was it? I was analyzing their previous constitution and their like sort of proposed new constitution, and it's like that's like a year ago. I'm still not sure like if it's really complete. Anyways, it's just like these kinds of like governance transitions take time. DAOs don't necessarily operate the fastest anyways. And then you try to sort of stack on this like big governance transition to like a different way of acting, and it just takes time. I think like Yearn V2 is still like, is that done? Like
You're like 2.0?
2.0, yeah. Yeah, I don't think so. Like, I think Track ended up spending.
Governance proposal.
I mean, it's a good proposal, right? But like, I think Track got distracted by other things as well. So, anyways.
Yeah, I think that's back to your question, like what kind of things can communities do to kind of help them progressively decentralize, in the best way for them or whatever, which is, I think it does come back to distributed power being like the core property there, because like if that's the case, whatever you're using, I mean, you can be in Discord as long as there's like, the blockchain's just nice for forcing that, right? But like socially, you can do that in Discord and it's fine. The important part is that everybody has a voice. That's like the main thing. So if everybody has a voice and people are asking, should we decentralize this? Then eventually they'll say, yeah, we should decentralize that. But I think one of the core design problems that you face, or that we all face, when, like you said, like if you don't start decentralized, we're already coordinating. So like tucking in, now we're gonna like decentralize this process that we're barely coordinating on already, and that's like very costly. Like coordination cost on that is very, very high. So a lot of times the community will say, let's do it later, But again, as long as everyone has the voice on that, I think it's fine. Like if that's all we're doing here is we're just decentralizing. We're not decentralized, and we're not anywhere fucking close to being decentralized in any way, completely anyway. Like not there again. Yeah, maybe there are some protocols that can be like decentralized, and they have this one specific use case, and you can decentralize the components that go into that. But larger systems and like real communities of people doing things together, like that's a lot of fucking things to decentralize that we don't have. We don't have decentralized discords. We don't have these things. So, but it comes down to like, I think the best thing that community can do is just make sure that everybody's voices are heard and that they're operating as a DAO, and that's my definition. Yeah. But it's a really fucking hard problem. So, but we just need to take our time and decentralize. Keep decentralizing. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to give a really big +1 to that. Coordinate first, then decentralize. Or I was actually just having an interesting conversation with, well, not a conversation, but like, we're doing this study of like Web3 constitutions, or DAO constitutions, and like recently chatting with Nick at ENS, who was the primary author of the ENS constitution. And it's interesting because a lot of people, I've been using constitutions as a kind of proxy for coordination, right? Not exactly the same thing, but it's interesting because they launched their DAO, they launched their constitution with the DAO, whereas most people kind of have the DAO first, or something like that they claim is the DAO, and then months or years, or maybe never, they get their constitution, and they sort of say, oh, we have this kind of governance, and like we've actually did some thinking about it. And it's like, yeah.
Yeah, that's how Dawn is good.
It's like, so I mean, it just depends. Like different operational requirements, different like just like facts on the ground require different kinds of approaches. But I generally think it would be like I'm not saying you should like write a 20-page constitution that like says this is what our community will be working. This is never going to work, right? But like doing the minimum amount of planning, and just say like, we thought about this, we care about this enough to think about it. I think that's really good. I don't know. I thought like ENS did really really well.
Yeah, Constitution. Well, it's interesting to have like this yardstick. It's almost like having a creative constraint for an artwork or a series of artworks, right? You have this defined frame that you can always measure against. But I know you kind of made fun of it as well, because I think the frame that the comment, it's like for these large things that already exist, then decentralizing afterwards, which is, as you said, like mostly very hard experience to go through. It's like opening up a marriage kind of a thing. I haven't seen it succeed very well, at least not without significant degrees of pain. And that's fine, like it's a necessary state that we're in now. But I want to be an old man at some point, or an old woman if something happens. I just want to be old and watch 2-3 generations down the line. The things that are born after the possibility of DAOs is actually commonplace, because we are putting so much mind into this transitional pains, which in my opinion is a non-issue. So it's really easy for us to talk like, oh, the old politicians will die and then the new people will come. We will also die. This transitional period is necessary, but it's not the most interesting thing for me personally. Because I think like a poet, like he's a researcher. I think like a poet. So I'm allowed wild flights of imagination, right? And that's what I'm working really hard to give myself permission to have. So I just want to know what the things that are born as this will feel and operate like. And we can maybe expedite the becoming of this world by not giving a shit about the transitional things. Like I'm not saying everyone stop. I'm saying give yourself permission. If it doesn't feel interesting to try to perform or support this organizational alchemy, go do it from the ground up new, because there's very smart people engaging heavily with this organizational alchemy, and like it's fucking honor for me that there was that full day researcher like what is it's like a, it's not a conference, when researchers get together, what's it? A symposium. Yeah. There was like a legit, like phenomenal symposium happening in a dungeon. And I was like, cool. It was super awesome. But then we all need to brace against each other, in my opinion, and like find out what is your ignition and just go like wildly through that. And I know that I can be weird, wildly imaginative poet, weird asshole, because Josh exists. And we're not in, like, you know, it's really the systemic result that matters. And it's like a big orchestra. And this is what I'm a little bit disappointed by, that we don't have language yet to collectively be an accidental but harmonious orchestra of operators. And that's maybe what can come out of spaces like this, right? I don't know where I'm going. It's a long-ass panel, again. Just
Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates. I think something like a fractal organization or community that I've been most closely associated with is something like a meta cartel, which started off as these seeds of individuals that came together with a mission to just fund the building of dApps in the space, right? And like the thing that started off is that they had a very simple manifesto that they agreed upon, and they didn't set out to build a product. They just kind of aggregated just individuals who wanted to do something, right? And I think something that resonated with what you said, Felipe, was that large organizations are kind of spending a lot of resources and time right now to agree on something, rather than just getting the 5 most informed, high-context individuals to go out and build that thing. And I think one of the things that I've observed with the Metacartel community is that that is what they did, and now it fractalized into Metafactory and Metagamma Delta, and yeah, and it's just this entire ecosystem of of DAOs or products that have spawned out of this fertile, I think, seed of a community, and I agree, there is no language. Yeah. Yeah, it was from meta transactions, right? And figuring out how to do meta transactions. Yeah. Yeah, and so, so I think it's been really interesting to be a part of that, but I agree that there's no language right now to kind of describe how that feels, but you really feel it and see it happening, and now you have this operators, and it's a lot more porous, and it's a lot more dynamic what people contribute to. And yeah, just people taking initiative. So I was wondering, then with Raid Guild and DAO House and people with Metagame, what has that kind of experience been like for you as builders and sometimes summoners of some of these fractal organizations that spawned out of this seed community?
So Metacartel has this tagline, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And people always focus on this second part, like, oh, we want to go far, so let's go together. But sometimes you need to go fast. And so a lot of us, okay, we want to do this, and forked off and created other DAOs. And then those DAOs start going slow because they get big. And I don't know where I was going with that. I just wanted to say that. How do I feel about it? I think it's necessary because, yeah, you can't just wait for everybody to come to consensus and then do something and just, yeah, for me, I like this autonomy part, people being encouraged to just go out and do something.
First off, I just want to, how do I say it? Acknowledge all the love that Felipe has been sending my way, and send it, how do I say it? Send it back, and then spread it to everybody in this room so that we can all start our DAOs. But if by starting a DAO means starting a Discord, please don't invite me to your Discord. I have too many. On the question of the fractal nature of DAOs, I think that's actually a super important point that, this is you don't have to look at DAOs to sort of get an understanding of this. If you just look at Reddit, Reddit data, where new Reddits come from, tons of new Reddits come from splitting or forking or some sort of subdivision of existing Reddits, right? And this is true of lots and lots of different classes of online communities. There's folks, I think what's his name? Chen, I think, at Colorado. Anyways, just you can Google genealogy of these kinds of communities, and there's studies of this. And it's really interesting data to see kind of the forking and very occasionally re-merging of these communities. So in some sense, if you want to start a DAO, maybe one of the best ways of doing so is to go deep into an existing DAO, and then find your little group, your group of buddies, and split off from that. Because this, I think, is really good because it powers gets people into existing DAOs, makes them more dynamic and active, but also, you know, gives people a point of essentially launch for whatever new projects they want to build. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it's really obvious in retrospect what happens, right? It's like you have, like, just like the Metacartel example is like, you know, it's just people that are together, and yeah, they're coordinating through a smart contract, so they use, like, you know, everybody threw in like 10 ETH or whatever. They didn't have to trust each other to do that. There was no, oh, you know, so-and-so can run off with the money because it's a DAO. I literally put my money in and I still have power over that. I can leave whenever I want before the money's spent or whatever. Very low coordination cost. Incredible. That's the most important thing there, right? It's like, if I don't have to trust you, then I can just take a gamble and I can try to coordinate with you. And then when you do, and then no one runs away with the money, now you have trust. And then once you have that trust, now you can be like, oh, well, you're a builder, I'm a builder, nobody else is builders here. Let's go do a little builder DAO so that we can like do some stuff over there and like have our little tighter thing or whatever. And then that just happens over and over and over again. But the important part that I'm realizing is that tiny bit of peer-to-peer human trust building is the most, probably one of the most valuable emergent properties of DAOs. And I was joking yesterday, but it's like kind of like DAOs are kind of just like training wheels to get us to that point of where we can just trust and coordinate, because that's it. The same, it scales. Like once you have that trust, now like Pete and I can just coordinate crazy, crazy fast, or any of us can like all coordinate because we already have that trust. Now it's like we can try new things together and fail, or win, or whatever the fuck. But that trust is super, super important, which is very opposite of a lot of things that we talk about in blockchain. You know, like trustlessness, and super, super important to get us to coordinate. But then once we're coordinating, now we have the trust, and now we can do things really, really fast, really, really cheap, and really fucking colorful, amazing, beautiful things together. It's really, really powerful. And the fractalization, it's just been really awesome to observe how humans naturally self-organize without structures that are like binding them, how they should coordinate. Like that's kind of where we are in this space. We get to just kind of see how humans naturally organize without, you know, us designing processes before that happens. We do that way too often. But, you know, when we don't, then we get to actually observe how humans self-organize and how relationships really form and how strong relationships form. Then those strong relationships form strong communities, and those strong communities build fucking fractalized communities. And then those keep fractalizing into various coordination units of people doing whatever the hell they want to do together with all the support of the rest of the network that they came from. So again, it's just like exponential fucking coordination power that we're gaining here that we can use for whatever we want. But that's like, that trust is really like key to what is happening here, I think.
I have a few things to say, but like I don't disagree with anything that was said. So just underlining a few things. So the DAO is a mechanism that expedites the process of trust building, but also it's like a shoulder that grows. So like it's easier to build that trust by having a checked mechanism that at least avoids the worst of all consequence. And then you can actually have that training wheel and build, cool. But so, no, and also I feel that the other component of this is also an amazing mechanism to make the breaking of trust visible when it needs to happen. And so it's really hard to keep a like untrust event hidden once it happens, right? I'm sorry to call out Aragon, you guys in the front row. When are you gonna write that fucking book? Do I need to get you a movie deal? I don't know what the fuck happened. Several times. I wanna have a conversation about it. Somebody please just tell me. I won't tell anyone. I just wanna know. So it's really hard to to actually hide. Maybe you can keep data off, but everybody, it's like a fabric. There's a relational fabric that expands towards the horizon. And once you dent that fabric, it will never, there's a maximum, so it's like you're talking about social viscosity, there's also social elasticity. There's a limit to how much you can damage that fabric, and it won't form back the same way, right? Again, it's almost like there's a clay body that can be shaped and then put into a furnace and then solidified into a useful vessel and then can be beautified and colored. And then I guess you guys really need to come to MetaHub and let me talk about social shit and pottery at the same time, because it's the best metaphor, right? And again, is that fabric of relational possibilities, which allow me with you to give away my focus on identity and become something else through and with you in relationship. So you're always flipping back and forth fractally in your attention pattern between two mother actions. One is being, and the other one is becoming. When you're safe, when you feel safe, you don't have to affirm so much being, and we can become together. And this is not hippie shit. This is technical, social design shit, at least from my point of view. And if you want to listen to me talk about Goethe forever and blah, 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 we can do that. But so this, because there's no best practice for this, it's hyper-aware practitioner contextual navigation. That is just what a fighter, like, you can't say like, just drive this fighter jet in that direction forever. Driving a Mach 3 fighter plane just takes a lot of simplicity. You have one job. Keep that shit flying and don't hit anything. Same thing with a pot running in the wheel. Same thing with a painting. A painting can be like paused, but you cannot pause a race car, right? You cannot pause the bus. You just have to go into the alpha flow state of practitioner hyper-awareness that is at the same time creative and at the same time at service. And DAOs will demand from the operators to create some kind of art in politics and in relational spaces for us to actually bring us to a increased coordination throughput at a global scale. And the beauty of this is it won't happen with one big ass fucking DAO. It's not gonna happen. It's the DAOist that matters. And I'm not shilling my project. I'm just realizing all the things that are behind the whole adventure. And weirdly enough, I feel like if we work at each of ourselves and the next person, and you give a shoulder, and then he gives a shoulder, and then she gives a shoulder, and they give a shoulder, the fabric that gets built might be interesting. And it's like, my life is not necessarily super easy right now in terms of like just the amount of stuff that I have to do, but it's because of the fabric that's going on that I just like, I wake up, I open my eyes, it's like, all right, another day, and we just do it, you know? So thank you. It's because of you.
So about building the actual fabric, like in terms of DAO tooling.
Ah, yeah, sorry. We are the tools.
We are the tools. We are tools?
Unfortunately. Yeah, the state of actual tooling. Do we even want to go there? Go there. I was just gonna say that it's okay. The DAO fabric doesn't exist. The tools are all in different places. Everybody's using 10 different tools, and they're all on different websites, and it's fucked.
Well, the tours are getting funded. I mean,
It's all happening, or it's all like all over the place right now. Everybody's still building like Web 2 versions with like Web 3 like wallet logins. That's not interoperable. That's what you're working on, like, trying to set the standards. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's a big problem, I think.
yeah, definitely. Thank you for helping me shill. So yeah, we run a standards body called DAOstar 1, which is trying to address some of these, like this lack of interoperability in the space. where everybody's trying to build their own shit, and sometimes it gets used, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it creates this fragmentation in the space where like nobody knows what the hell's going on, and innovations, you know, they happen like in various places, and then they die with those things, and that's kind of sad because hey, I think we'd all benefit from those really great ideas if they could somehow get disseminated and spread across the ecosystem, right? Just riffing on something that Felipe said, I think for some reason there was a reference to Goethe, and I was thinking, you know, there's this like some dude, maybe actually girl as well, I can't remember, put out a game theoretic analysis of the contract between Faust and Mephistopheles.
Send me this.
It's great. It's great. It's like, okay, somebody actually, you know, wrote this up, built a formal model. Like, how does one negotiate with the devil? I was just thinking, can you build a DAO that, you know, if DAOs are sort of trust vehicles, right? Can you ever get Faust to trust Mephistopheles, or vice versa? I mean, like, some problems are hard.
This is a cool direction. Fuck. Because, I mean, so is Mephistopheles the devil? Question number one. Or he's just a servant, right? Is he just a demon?
He's some bad dude.
Hard-coded malicious actor.
Hard-coded malicious actor, yeah. Ever serial.
Well, is he though? Because, I mean,
He wants your soul.
he wants your soul, but do I want, like, yeah, is Faust the malicious actor? Because Faust kept this demon enslaved for hundreds of years to his life, doing every bidding that he wanted for years and years and years and years and years and years. Like, they fucking went everywhere. They traveled in time. They had bacchanals with witches. They did all, like, if you didn't read Faust, I'm sorry. It's very boring, but it's an interesting seminal piece. All right. Hundreds of years of servitude to this bored human, basically, because Instagram didn't exist. And until the contract is, in case you haven't read Faust is a researcher, a seeker of knowledge, somebody who wanted to know everything about everything. And he did learn a fuck ton, and then he realized his life was meaningless. He was bored, had no true reason to be alive. And then one day he's walking home and a black poodle shows up and follows him home. And when he gets home, the poodle's like, Faust was also a occult practitioner. He had like sensing capabilities. He was a little bit of a magician or a wizard kind of a dude, or at least he was aware of the existence of ethereal realms. And he could sense that the dog wasn't a dog. There's something wrong about the dog. And then the dog, poof, manifests into a demon from behind in a puff of green smoke. Goethe was very theatrical. In a puff of green smoke from behind his oven, the stove. And he says, I am that, the sentence, I only know it in German, but it's a beautiful paragraph of Mephistopheles saying that he is the power of, like, it's so beautiful, just go Google it. And then, cool. So the contract is, if Mephistopheles is able to provide an experience of true, deepening, absolute satisfaction, when that exact moment of true realization happens to Faust, he shall die, and Mephistopheles will take his soul to serve him for eternity. Right? That was the contract. And that does happen. Do you remember when it happens? Can you describe the moment?
I don't remember anymore, but it's like, isn't it when he like is experiencing?
So,
Like
no, that's Gretchen. Gretchen is in the beginning. So basically, they go through all this shit, like literally satanic rituals and orgies and homunculus in a fucking bottle, like everything that you can. He meets Helen of Troy, falls in love with Helen of Troy, fucks Helen of Troy. Everything happens, and then he just decides to build a society. He buys a piece of land. There's an old couple living in the piece of land. He asks Mephistopheles to kill them. He sets their shed on fire, and then the old couple dies. And then he just puts people to work and starts developing the land. And one day he's looking over the land from the cliff, and he sees the desire of human entrepreneurship and achievement and the people toiling and working. And he said, I never saw larger beauty. And he dies. That is the apex of Faust. 2, which nobody reads. But you know what happens after that?
Is it after?
There is an after. Because does Mephistopheles keeps the soul of Faust? In Goethe's version, 1, he doesn't. God intervenes because he saw the true misguided desire for beauty and building in the soul of Faust. And God goes, shut up, demon, I'm the boss, and takes Faust to heaven. And God is a female energy. Goethe, good job.
Story time.
So we actually just went past the hour and we have about 15 minutes left in the panel. I wanted to open it up to the audience, actually. I'm sure a few of you here are building DAO tooling. We got a bit sidetracked. But yeah, like any comments from?
Okay, so Felipe talked a little bit about elasticity in organizations, and this got me thinking about how organizational memory works at a global heightened level, right? How we remember what takes place in our organizations and how that translates into our cooperation possibly, or our collaboration with communities, or goddamn, I don't want to use the word communities. Organization communities, that's okay. Basically, like, what happens when there is a group of people that doesn't coordinate well, or they do something malicious, right, within their own community or their own organization, with their own brand, and then they can essentially dissolve and become a new DAO. How do I really like remember what happened with that group? I don't know what the answer is to it, but I guess I just got thinking about that because I think there's this elasticity within a single organization, and then there's this larger elasticity on a global scale where it's like, okay, what can we actually tolerate as a society for, I guess, like, for the kind of mishaps that happen within a given organization? Like, how can we, like, we can't prevent a DAO from being created, right? We can't prevent a bunch of malicious actors from leaving a certain organization and then starting up a new one and potentially even becoming more malicious and gaining more, but just a thought I had. And then one thing I wanted to share too is around this kind of around this like mesh network that we're experiencing. And like, I think of scale-free organizations when we talk about DAOs that can grow into infinitum, where it's like, kind of Pete described it, you have a bunch of groups that just kind of spin off and self-create, self-select. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful aspects of what we're creating here is like, DAOs can really capture this rapid emergent energy that comes with a group of people collaborating. And when they align around something and there's clear goals and a mission involved, they can self-organize and create without having to go through the traditional means of, okay, let's buy some physical property, let's file a bunch of like legal paperwork. Not that I don't think you should do that, you should. But I'm just saying, like, the rubber hits the road a lot quicker when you're operating in this fashion. And so now you take all those pieces and put it together with what we're actually trying to do here, right? The networking event, or like the propensity for knowledge to transfer and for learning to take place within these organizations is something I've never seen before, like I've never experienced before. And I think a lot of people haven't experienced that, and it's a new phenomenon. So I don't think there's a question in sight, and I just went on a rant, but those were all thoughts I was having and wanted to share while you guys were up here.
Anybody else? Questions or? Yeah, don't be scared.
I just want to respond very briefly to the not a question, but I would say I usually think of this in terms of like knowledge management, and there's lots of different tools for doing this, right? And it's quite interesting how to do this within centralized organizations when you have like enterprise knowledge management systems, document management, agreement management, and how you would do that in decentralized networks where you like, just imagine if, I don't know, like all Reddit had like a shared knowledge base. Kind of do, but kind of don't. I would also kind of, one thing that might be interesting if you're thinking about like, where do you see continuity between like one DAO ending and another DAO beginning? What happens that carries over? Clearly there is data that carries over, right? Or the data is immutable in some sense. One of the things we're trying to work on right now as part of like the DAO standards conversations is like a bunch of tooling. A bunch of folks doing tooling are working together right now. So this like Closer, Station, Disco, Spruce, a couple of these kinds of folks working more on the identity space, trying to come up with a standard for membership, like DAO membership via attestations. So the basic idea is that, actually the use case is extremely simple. We want to enable people to have essentially Web3 CVs. So you want to be able to verify that you participate in a DAO, and then to use that to give to other DAOs and say, hey, I did these things. You should hire me, give me money, or fund my proposal, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a kind of like a balance of power here because you don't want to be able to like give DAOs total control over this. Like DAOs can attest to things, but then that attestation gets recorded and lives somewhere else, perhaps by a service provider who aggregates these things. Yeah. And then at some point there's like either an expiration or a revocation, but that can't be willy-nilly because you can't work for a DAO and then for whatever reason the DAO says I don't like you anymore and said you never worked for me. That doesn't work either, right? It's also sort of like privacy concerns because you never want to put immutable PII, private information onto like a blockchain. It's just like kind of a bad idea, though it happens all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way we're headed in. I'm sorry, I just want to respond to it. It's like verifiable credentials, right? Where
this is not a use case of verifiable credentials, though. Okay. It is a pattern that is. Yeah, it's actually much simpler because VCs are not they're not like well adopted yet. So
yeah. Okay, I know James Young from Collab Land. He's working on a solution using VCs with off-chain data to basically distribute NFTs in a kind of point system kind of fashion where people who don't even have a wallet and just have their Discord can start to gain attestations and carry those through to different communities, which I think is going to be fucking level up for the entire space. Because if we as DAOs can start to, what did you say?
It's like POAP, actually.
Right.
We don't have a POAP for this event, guys.
What? But yeah, I would have been ranting for a little bit. If anyone has any other thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the non-tooling questions. I love the part about the fabric of the community. But yesterday here there was someone from Graviton from the tech token engineering commons, and they were talking about like conflict resolution. And I wanted to hear your thoughts around when should you try to conflict resolve and when should you fork? Like, how do you think about where that balance lies?
My first instinctive reaction is when in doubt, fork it.
Try to coordinate.
Because in the, Fork it. No, I guess just the price of not like giving yourself permission to go fast and alone is, so like ideally, practitioner and the group, the hyper-object of the group of practitioners should be very self-aware on how much of their identity they want to give away in relationship, right? So if you're really in doubt, fork it, because there might be, the conflict doesn't, like, I hate the term conflict resolution, right? There's a lot more harmony to honest conflict than dishonest harmony. There's a lot more to be gained, right? And sometimes the conflict just solves itself if you're willing to step away. The illusion, the lie there is that you are not enough and you're not self-sufficient as a human. And so what happens in a space where you're safe, you're supported, you have a bunch of co-practitioners, you know your talents, and you know where to take it in any case scenario, is the lack of fear. Staying together for fear is the reason why people stay in bad marriages for a very long time. You don't need to. So becoming aware of like why you exist, what you know how to do, and several places where you can deploy it is the talk that I was supposed to give today, but I didn't have time to prepare. And a future DAOist close to you, because nobody will give me talks at the other fucking events. And when they do, they put me in the side stage where 2 people are watching. It's fine. Yes, you are. The freedom that comes with self-awareness and self-sufficiency makes you not have to resolute conflict. And then you become allowed to stand for something and just tell people to fuck off. This is what I would do in general, and it should be socially acceptable. The idea that the presence of pain requires an immediate action to try to relieve pain is what heroin addicts do. Don't do that. It's my opinion. Personal opinion does not, the DAOist does not approve this message. It's personal opinion.
I actually like where this is going, but I think, well, yeah, forking is, I guess, another one of those words, language terms that has like, you know, whatever good and bad connotations depending. I would love to see more forking though. Like, I think, you know, you and I were talking about social viscosity a lot in where we were last time. But you know, and I think that's part of it. Like Raid Guild, you talk about Raid Guild, and I would love to see like everybody keeps trying to pile into Raid Guild, but the community can't handle that. You know, like we really need forks. We need to be like, we need 100 fucking Raid Guilds, you know, or whatever. But there's a real thing. There are many real things there where like nobody else knows how to run a Raid Guild or whatever the fuck, you know. So you got to go through Raid Guild first. So I'm really interested to see like how, and I think you said something earlier about when you were talking about the GitHub repo, like the GitHub DAOs, like re-merging. So like, I mean, yeah, like I said, there's many things here, but like, what are we forking? Are we forking work streams? Are we forking organizations? That's a big fork. You know, forking an organization is very, very costly because you have like all these things already built up to coordinate so well, and now to fork is very, very expensive. So again, if we stay much more primitive in like work streams and things like that, then it's much cheaper to fork. And if we make forking cheaper, then we also need to make merging cheap, you know. So we need to like allow for people to go and fork off and go try things on their own, go fast, do it. But we will welcome you back. You know, like that kind of energy I think is what we need more of. And then we can just kind of have like, we can all be running off in different directions, experimenting and providing value and failing and whatever, but learning from all that. And then, okay guys, we failed, can we come back? Great, yeah, let's fucking coordinate, you know? Yeah, let's fucking coordinate.
A linguistic device that might help with this is try to not adjectivize, not even in your thought process. Don't adjectivize people, adjectivize the situation. So conflict happened. You don't say, you're a fucking asshole. Don't say that. Just say, this feels uncomfortable. And I'm gonna go over there, feel something else. And maybe we talk later, right? Because the labeling, and it's what creates the problem. And then it leaves very little pathway for redemption or re-self-definition. And sometimes people really do horrible things. And we should not, like, because I love you, it's okay. That's the waking up at the Monster Factory, which I will keep quoting every week of my life until everyone has watched it and we give up on nuclear families. But I'm just a terrorist, so don't listen to me. It's a joke.
Yeah, so we could talk about tooling. I'm gonna mix it up though. So I'm a freedom maximalist, and I think all of the tools that we use should be forkable and open. And Developer DAO officially supports DAO Star 1 and the effort to make everything free and open and forkable and standard. But on the theme of making deals with the devil, there are a lot of closed platforms that are actively trying to bribe us and other groups, supplying free platforms, saying they'll pay gas or just give us straight cash payments if we become users of their platforms. And I resist this, but I can't spend all day resisting these kinds of efforts. And I expect that there will be some groups that take advantage of these opportunities and grow successful in some ways on the back of them and feed the beast. And I see this as sort of a bad historical outcome that I'd like to avoid. What can we do collectively to make sure that open tooling succeeds, if we can do anything?
I don't know. I just want to say, I heard somebody say there are now more DAO tools than there are DAOs. That's fun.
Let's try to stick to this question because it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, it's a really difficult question. And one I think about quite often, in the sense that, you know, it's quite connected to like how successful a standard is. There's like two general ways you could imagine a standard working. Like wide adoption, right? Where lots of people work together, decide on, like kind of like early internet, like Web 1.0, right? You know, a lot of people agree on a common protocol, they agree to use it, it's shared, it's open, it's free, and then what comes out of that is that, you know, permissionless ecosystem where there's lots of tools, and maybe that's a good thing. But the other way is, you know, like Facebook or OpenSea, right? Where you just enforce a standard through massive adoption. If you manage to get there first and move fast enough and execute well enough, then you own the ecosystem. You enforce the standard. And like, you can look at like NFTs at this point. Like nobody actually like follows like token URI isn't used anymore. People implement contract URI because they want to have that integration with OpenSea, right? So it's the OpenSea setting the standards. And like that's not necessarily a bad thing all the time in all the cases. But if you look at cases like Facebook/Meta, right? You know, I was just at a conference where, what was it? The chief legal counsel, the general counsel of Meta, this like amazingly...
They're Facebook. Don't play into that bullshit.
well,
that's already a word they can't have.
She's literally like, she's shilling metaverse, right? And it's incredible in some sense because she's like so amazingly qualified in so many ways. But it's like, you know, like working for this giant mega conglomerate. And the question that she very, very clearly did not address is, as she's pitching, oh, this wonderful open metaverse where it's free, where it's, you know, like so many sort of nice things and we're doing so many good stuff. And it's like, who actually owns this platform? Who is going to build this future that you're painting for us where we're like walking around these virtual worlds and, you know, it's only for the way stuff. It's a little weird, actually. There's like no legs on these things. But yeah, it's like, it's just like a question you have to ask. Do you trust the person who's going to be making these decisions, who's going to be implementing that code? And that's honestly a decision that we have to make as an entire ecosystem. And I would say it's not just up to us as tooling developers, it's up to the users. And if you want the users to make the decisions that you, quote unquote, you want them to make, or you think it's like optimal social good, you need to engage them. If that makes any sense.
Are you proposing some kind of open tooling coalition where DAOs will sign on and say we'll only use open tooling, and if you defect from the coalition, then we'll hit you with a vampire attack or something?
Wait. Did I just get like conned into launching a project?
Again.
Because for the hammer, the whole world is nails, I think the solution here is a narrative one about what a successful life is, like what is a good life well lived. We need to meme into existence a fact that if you are doing this, you're just lame. You have less sex, you have less friends, you go to less parties, you have less opportunities, nobody lets you in their event. You're just lame, and you go be lame in the corner. Because any other attempt to actually shape the behavior of everyone, any attempt, even if it's everybody be vegan, we're gonna save the world, any mind path in that direction is nothing but fascism. Every possible instance of behavior will happen at least once, right? So what we have just to do is make it lame as fuck, and just be the interesting thing and have the cooler life, you know? So if every attractive female and male in the world refuse to partner with people who do things that shouldn't be done, you just solved the entire universe. Solved it, right?
Don't fuck closed source collaborators.
I didn't say that. I'm just saying that every human needs the same things. We create very bizarre stories to need the same things that we all need. And at the bottom of that need pile, and the center maybe, or somewhere, I don't know, spatially, you can vectorize this later somewhere. Everyone just wants the same one thing, which is feel special. That's the only thing. And ironically, no one is special at all, ever. And then so we create very elaborate behavior patterns and stories in our head, webs of meaning, to convince ourselves that at least we should get out of bed. And this is at the center of everything. We can manipulate this inevitable pattern of consciousness because you have to be someone. You can't just melt into everyone else. We can manipulate this to collectively decide what's okay and what's not okay in our rituals and social things, and who gets to do what, and etc. That's the only strategy I have, trying to answer your question directly. Now, as an offer, because we're going to have to answer the panel, let's talk directly on what we can actually do, and then do it fast. 5 people in a small DAO. Instead of just debating and writing the standards and stuff, do that. But let's also take immediate action in making lame shit feel lame and cool shit feel cool.
Okay, I want to say something. Yes, don't fuck closed source, but also do fuck open source, right? Do fuck standards. Do that.
I just want to address those people directly. Like, don't build DAO tools if you're not a DAO. We don't want your centralized closed source shit. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All righty. I don't know if the microphone is actually working yet. Let's double check. Right, yeah, there we go. The microphones are on. All right, so thank you all for joining. We're about to be getting a panel discussion on governance in DeSci, or decentralized science, off. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Please feel free to come grab a seat. But to just get us started, I figure we'll just go around and do some introductions, and everyone can, say who they are and what projects they're
I guess I'll go first. Eugene, I assume you'll introduce at the end. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Shadi. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, although I do a little bit less of that these days. I feel a little bit bad about it because I really do love science. I've been working on DAOs and how we can start bridging academic communities with web-native technology that allows us to coordinate and be able to do things that we traditionally didn't have the space, the room, or the capacity, or maybe even in some cases permission to do. And so about a year ago, I kind of translated my love for open science and its practice in neuroimaging research into an experiment for a DAO, or what hopefully will become a real-life functioning DAO, called OpSci. So OpSci is a community of Web3 developers, engineers, some scientists, and we're working on solving some of the issues with data sharing, publication, and also other tooling other science tooling that right now really needs a massive overhaul. So I think that's it for now, and then I can talk more later.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. I'm a physician scientist and also not doing a lot of medicine or science for that matter lately. I'm a founder of LabDAO, which is, again, another decentralized science project which takes a focus on the actual laboratory execution of experiments. So I tend to think of science as this three-step process where it's first you spec out the idea, what do you want to do, and you raise funding for it. And then you actually go into the lab, or you work with instrumentations, you work with tools to run the experiment and gather new information about the universe. And then step 3, you tell everybody else about it. And I care a lot about the second step. So using tools and basically making tooling available, because I think that's currently what's sort of stopping us from just accelerating the progress in science, that a lot of tools are held back, or they're more inaccessible than we would like them to be, and that I think they need to be. And at LabDAO, we're a community of scientists and engineers that is working towards a peer-to-peer exchange in which scientists can trade favors with each other, services with each other, and collaborate just across national borders, raise funding in Web3, do the science in Web3, and then publish it using Web3 tools.
Wonderful. I have my own. And you did catch the most uncomfortable chair. I'm so sorry for you, Nicholas.
It's only 80 minutes.
80 minutes. Okay, my name's Alison. Thanks all for joining. Really good to see so many familiar faces and then so many new ones. I am not a scientist. I'm, I think, more like a, scientist cat herder. And they are wild. But I work for Foresight Institute, which is an organization that has been around for 35 years and really quite on the cutting edge of supporting early stage science and technology development that is usually a little bit too ambitious for legacy funders to take on. So we were founded by Eric Drexler on his book Engines of Creation that was all about molecular nanotechnology, but people care a ton about rejuvenation technologies, everything from cryonics to actually rejuvenation in this life. And then a bunch of other more outlandish things like asteroid mining, brain-computer interfaces, and so forth. Luckily, we also always had a very big crypto community, more the cryptography community, but then many of them actually moved into crypto when crypto became crypto commerce. And so that, brings me here, because suddenly many of the tooling that I think was often theoretically available and that many of these folks worked on is now suddenly coming live and can actually support many of the other scientific groups that we all care about. And so in that regard, I think it's a really, really fruitful time, because suddenly we have actually the technology available to revolutionize all of the other science and technology development that many of us ultimately really, really care about. So I'm super, super excited. It's very still a nascent space, but I couldn't be happier to be a tiny part of it.
And we're excited to have you as a part of supporting the nascent space, so thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric. I'm here representing DeSci Labs, who is working on recreating the back end of science and rethinking the way that scientific collaboration can happen. I personally am more on the organizational science side, having come from a background in mechanical engineering where definitely wanted to be a scientist, was passionate about science, but quickly saw a lot of the problems in academia and decided that a PhD wasn't necessarily the best route for me. At this point, I would consider myself a scientific cat herder as well. And speaking of that, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, we will be hosting a full-day conference on this topic tomorrow at the Boom Chicago venue called DeSci Day. If you go through the Dev Connect schedule, you should be able to find it. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to talk to anyone on this panel afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for the shameless DeSci Day plug. We're definitely excited about that. I think it's going to be the first Blockchain plus Science conference since Blockchain in Science in 2017 and 18. So it's been a while, and definitely excited to get more active discussions and community around that. But yeah, hi everyone, I'm Eugene. I'm the head of operations at the Smart Contract Research Forum. We're a grant-funded organization focused on advancing research in the Web3 space. So our foray into this wider DeSci community has been, even though we're not looking at science broadly, we're looking at specifically research as it applies to the Web3 ecosystem, we are still very interested in understanding what does open peer review look like for independent researchers, for people who aren't pushing to a publication venue or to a conference. And especially given how much of Web3 was built by independent researchers, we want to figure out what is that sort of meta research layer to support individuals in that kind of position. And we think it's just a much better approach than us trying to reinvent the wheel and probably do what scientists have been doing and know what goes well and hasn't on our own. We're trying to learn from a bunch of folks who have been either doing that work directly, using Web3 tools to improve it, or generally exploring and building relationships with meta researchers overall. So yeah, that's sort of what brings me here today. And I think to start off the conversation, I'd be interested in getting sort of everyone's input in the easy and not thorny at all question of what do you define as governance? Because here we're talking about DeSci and governance, and we can get into the nuances of both of those, but I figure let's start off with governance itself.
I'm the first sacrificial lamb to venture out here and try to come up with let's see if I can lead the conversation in a way that gives us 80 minutes to fill. Yeah, so governance, let's see. Governance, I believe, is something that emerges when a group of people have to make decisions about some common shared substrate, resource, organization, and governance typically is something that is best characterized as an iterative process, and just in my experience, I think immediately when I think of science and governance, I think of committees that form around standards and how do we, have some set objective criteria or metrics to accomplish a goal that's independent perhaps of each individual's immediate maybe like accessory needs, but more related perhaps to the problems that they all share. So some sort of common identified problem statements, like for example, how do we all collect the same neuroimaging data across 2,000 scanners or across 2,000 different institutions around the world, and what data should we collect, and how should we structure it, and how do we resolve disagreements about that, and how do we come back to the drawing table and decide that something has worked or hasn't worked. So I guess kind of coming back into that, some of the items that come out of that are metrics for success and failure, mechanisms for iteration and identifying conflict or points of contact, and I think also having some sort of structure or program for conversations where new issues can be brought up or talked about and iterated on. So I think that's what I would say I think of when I think of governance, at least in my experience in scientific standards.
I think I'm going to constrain it to governance in the context of science to answer that question. I think science itself is a bit like art. It's a very free-flowing process, and I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing in traditional science is actually when governance or the ambition to govern something has crept into the actual process in which science is being done. I think so. A scientist or a group of scientists working on a problem that's very much like a jazz band and not like a marching band. And we need to basically, when we think about governance and decentralized science, we need to think about, okay, how can we set the stage for the jazz bands to play? And how do we differentiate between what's a jazz band and what's a marching band? Where do we need standards? Where do we need governance? And I think the governance is extremely important around standards. And that's why, actually, I think that's the killer application for Web3. You create token incentivized open source contributor communities that maintain a standard. Like, this is the standard way to store an MRI image. This is the standard way to run a large language model that learns representation of proteins. This is the way that we do this. But then the way that you use the tool is completely up to you. And effectively, we don't want to interfere with you sort of playing jazz as much as possible. And that's where these decentralized communities, I think, are extremely useful as a tool.
Yeah, I think very difficult to define. And I think, one thing that is exciting really about the space, thank you, is that we can experiment a bunch with it. And so, I think that the number one thing that we have to get good at is cooperation, and governance is for me like a subset thereof. And we have to get good at cooperation within science, but also at the larger scale, I think really as a civilization to move to really grandiose futures. And so I think governance is like a subset thereof. And sometimes, you have these spectrums of different cooperative structures, everything from natural language, which is super decentralized, and we nevertheless, figure out the Schelling point of words to use, whatever. But then all the way to like the very solidified, currently existing nation states. And so it's kind of a spectrum of cooperation, I think, in large. In the, I think, the DeSci world specifically, and one thing that I'm super excited about is the room for experimentation that's just suddenly like kicked open, and like suddenly all of the different dials that were always fixed, the non-profit menu, like the other types of organizational menus are now open, and we can experiment with it, which is on the one hand super exciting, but it's also deeply terrifying because many, like if you think about from a conservative perspective, many of these structures have solidified because they were actually like evolutionarily stable strategies, or like, they were actually there for a good reason. So by, we are already in a very experimental space in terms of the science that we support at Foresight. And so now actually kind of like also kicking the door open in terms of all the different governance like modules that you can like play with now is a lot. But I think that on a large scale, the community is super receptive to experimentation here, which is like something that I really, really cherish. Like people, are actively, I mean, the last panel really said it, actively supporting making mistakes. And I think that, as long as we can come back, I think, as was already discussed in the previous panel, I think we're there to learn a lot. So I think it's maybe something to be discovered through experimentation that we're doing now. Yeah, that's my number one, I guess, nutshell. We're figuring it out.
No, absolutely. And I want to echo that point about the importance of experimentation in this nascent space. One of the things that has been so amazing and incredible to get the chance to work with has been just the sheer number of people and projects who have shown an interest in trying to create decentralized science. And anything this early on in an ecosystem, you do kind of have to throw things against the wall and see what sticks. And I think that's something that we have been excellent at recently. And it's exciting to see. So back to the original question, what is governance? To me, governance is the process of deciding how to allocate power. Ultimately, someone has to do the work. Someone has to do the thing. Governance is the process of selecting which individual actually is going to be the person to execute, which individual or group of individuals, because the cooperation piece is also very important there. And I think it's important in DeSci to realize that as we're at this early stage, it's important to try new pieces of governance and to really focus on getting as wide of a net as we can early on. That's something that I think, is going to be very important moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about the elements of governance. Sort of, you need a group of people, you need some kind of shared resource, some kind of shared goal, decision-making focus across those, sort of aligning the resources and the actions taken around those resources to somehow align with that goal. And I think we also, in a variety of ways, touched on the importance of culture throughout it, because just the humans and a goal and some kind of asset, those are all individual components. The culture is what actually is the glue that makes it all stick or makes it all fall apart in the end. And I really appreciated in the previous panel when they were talking about the whole idea of, oh, we need to be okay with someone forking our ecosystem and then being welcomed back in. That's a culture problem. And I think right now, right, there's still the idea of like, oh, well, I'm rage quitting out. And so like, if I'm not happy with it, it's gonna be a big F you to everyone and just like, I'm out of here, I'm doing something better. And it's like, yeah, it's really tough to come back from that one. Like it all depends, just like if you ever left an employer and you're like, you know what I'm gonna do? Burn this place down on the way out. They're probably not gonna welcome you back one day, right? So it's like, what is the actual culture and the political nuance that is needed in these budding communities where like these things frequently come as an afterthought. But yeah, I just wonder from all of your perspectives, like what are some of the very important cultural tenets to set? And especially as some folks who are founders or leaders of your organization, do you feel like that culture starts with you and you are a bearer of that culture and you are an exemplar of that culture in this community that you're building? Or if you're inherently trying to build a decentralized community, you have to be part of making that culture, but if you dictate it, then that might subvert the power distribution or something like that. So I'd be really interested to think about how y'all think about that aspect.
Yeah, just listening to all of you have your kind of come at this problem question or statement from different angles, it really brings me back to think of how we solve like actual practical problems, like in practice, right? So you are trying to figure out the best way to isolate a protein, and you and the postdoc are alone in the lab, and you only have so much solute left of that one reagent. And now you have to decide, how's it gonna go down, right? Is it your hunch that's gonna win out, or is it the tried and true process that's always worked in the lab? So governance is that scaled up. How do you respect intellectual ownership, and how do you come to a decision over choices that might constrain which path you walk down the future? And to kind of bring it back to the discussions about science and culture, I think governance is probably not as is more important than we might immediately think, right? So how we choose to govern and make decisions and what mechanisms, whether it's winner take all or whether it's some sort of shotgun approach, right? Like with the Human Genome Project, where they tried tons and tons of different approaches and converged on something that worked. And they did so more quickly than more centralized approaches. That's going to constrain which tech trees we walk down, right? So mechanisms for governance that involve perhaps casting a wide net versus a magnet that attracts ideas within a certain lane, or maybe a projection or a roadmap that kind of prompts people to think about things in a certain way. So yeah, so I think when it comes to culture, there are probably some lessons to be taken from existing projects that have been successful or movements that have been successful. I think of Linux, right, or even just like early computer system architects or communities of architects that solved really difficult problems for organizing libraries or basically establishing all of the modern infrastructure that we need to run complex operating systems. I believe that's the ability. I think forking is an amazing thing, and it's something that's only been around relatively recently in our vocabulary, and I think we should explore that more. I have more thoughts on this too, but I would like to maybe pass it up.
I think there's this sort of dilemma that you have, especially when you start an organization. You do define to some extent the culture, and you do define the rules, at least in the early innings, and then it's also on you to sort of let go and let the system start to develop its own dynamic. And you always need to strike the balance. At least that's my sense right now, as we're sort of building LabDAO in the early innings. I think I do take a lot of inspiration from the open source community as well. So actually that's been a bit of like my secret playbook. It's like building out in the open, how do these open source communities succeed? And then literally what is working well there, and how does a token and like all the governance that comes on top of that token, how does that change it? And how can that also potentially break it? And what do we need to make sure, what do we need to do to make sure that Web3 is supercharging the power of these open source communities and these open science communities instead of like spinning it out of control into like a very unproductive direction. So generally, I really like the idea of forking, and I want this thing we're building to be forked as much as possible. And the way that we do this, for example, in LabDAO is that we have a particular category that I call teams, and every time I see a group of people that's forming that have a shared interest, I try to promote them to build a team. And then in my internal representation, it's like you have this sort of character development. First you join the DAO, and then you find a couple like teammates, and then you actually launch a team. We say, well, we're in this team. We really care about DNA sequencing, or we really care about protein engineering. And then the next step is we set up a recurring meeting for the protein engineering team. And then the way that I see the end game is that team will eventually have its own multisig and apply for funding from the DAO. And eventually they might generate IP and tools that are so valuable that they decide, wait, let's launch our own token. And then I want to be the first one to say, well, what you've been doing is so awesome. Can we like give you some of our tokens and you give us some of mine? You just built this sort of budding network of organizations. That's where I want to take the whole project we're building.
Oh, very actionable. I also, I guess, from experiential ground. I mean, Foresight, the organization like that I now run, has been around for 35 years, so that's a really long time. But nevertheless, people were already super kind of like experiment driven. So I think the culture has been there to at least now experiment much more with Web3, but I think that there are, like, especially, people always say that they want interdisciplinarity, but then when you get it, it's actually very difficult to make it work, because people definitely do come from very different contexts. So we launched basically an NFT gallery that supports our scientists by hooking them up with artists. Then people can buy an NFT that then supports the scientists directly. And our idea was, hey, we can shortcut much of the academic system by which lots of the grant money often gets captured by the academic institutions, by just making it a little bit more of an open marketplace where individual people can just buy the NFT of the scientists whose research they want to support, and it immediately funds the scientists. And that was nice in theory, but actually getting there was a lot, because the artists and scientists have very, very different cultural perspectives, obviously. And for scientists, I think, to be comfortable to engage more with Web3, we need to build really good on-ramps. And they need to be cultural, but they also need to be, crucially, very easy tool building wise. And so I think if we want much more of this merger, if we think that's valuable within DeSci specifically, then I think actually building systems by which we not only on-ramp scientists, but which we can actually also make them secure that funding will remain there. So, even when the next bubble bursts or whatever, funding will still be there and they can still have a home there. I think those are easy ways. At least for me, the biggest culture clash is still between science and Web3, just from a day-to-day operational sense, as I see trying to connect, build connective tissue there. So I think trying to make it as easy as possible for scientists to get comfortable with Web3, but then also when they take the reputational risk of moving into Web3, also making it easy for them to continue to get funding there. That would, I think, it's an easy, actionable bit, but I think that would actually help solve a lot of the problems.
I swear you're taking the words right out of my mouth here. The three things that I wanted to talk about with culture were experimentation, a genuine, honest respect for those around you, and then a genuine, honest respect for science as an entity in the scientific method. I think trying to build a culture, to Shadi's point, where forking is prominent across the space, where people feel empowered to try new things, to Nicholas's point, and where you can just come in and meet someone who's friendly, honest, hardworking, and has a similar vision to you, gives people a place to feel at home and a place to feel comfortable actually building. with that being said, I think it's important for us to also focus on scientific innovation and to really think about, how do we enable better science? I think in my definition of it, the mission of DeSci is supporting and enabling better science. And I think a large part of Web 2 and traditional science is going to be a huge part of that. To your point, on-ramps will be absolutely crucial, and building a space where people can feel comfortable coming from Web 2 into Web 3, trying to abstract away a lot of the Web 3 technologies as well, because I know the moment that you say token, the moment that you say contract or wallet or whatever it is, someone who's maybe not as familiar with the space is just immediately pushed away. So trying to build this culture of experimentation, teaming, and science would be my points there.
Yeah, and I kind of want to double click into this potential clash of culture, so to say, between academia or science traditionally and jumping over into decentralized Web3 communities, right? Because Web3 is, right, it's all about decentralization, which involves just embracing human messiness and dealing with the challenges that are inevitably involved with building community and bringing people together that have egos and different cultural norms and standards and all that fun stuff, right? And I just remember prior to joining SCURF, where I'm working now, I was working at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm not gonna call out specific professors, but I know it's oh, well, if you're going in Department X, you gotta have it Professor Y's way or it's the highway, or you're just not welcome. And CMU is a pretty decentralized ecosystem. They actually had a president a few years ago that tried to centralize it and got booted out in 6 months. I think people coming from Web3 who are not familiar with academia can unintentionally paint academics or scientists with an overly centralized brush, where the reality of the actual networks are truly decentralized. That's why a lot of the time people will go into science, is to get to run with their ideas and effectively be, the CEO of a little research lab effectively. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see the actual challenges of porting over these and it's not fair to say all scientific cultures have promoted, just be egocentric, but there's no shortage of ones that have put up with ego, because thanks to Professor X, Y, and Z, that's why we get the big donation money, that's why we get all the students applying. So how do you see those elements clashing, given that ego-oriented and ego-diffusive cultures that are needed transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize there, and I really identify with that picture and that you painted there, Eugene. Yeah, I personally identify. So if you're trying to pick up, science is hard. Science is very, very difficult. If you're trying to really, out of a sense of curiosity, passion, just an obsession with a problem, and trying to figure out how can I come at this in a new, unique way, to an extent, open source and open science tools are your bread and butter, because those are the tools that are going to get you started, right? Those are going to be the open libraries, the open toolkits, the literature that you can access and consume, the forum posts on Stack Overflow that give you all the things that you can't learn on your own, right? But you'll come to a point eventually where the knowledge stops. It's just not accessible anymore. There's just nothing else you can find on the internet or through accessible means. And you're gonna have to seek out that one person or couple of people and traverse this social graph and convince those people to speak to you, to spend their time teaching you, or reading your thoughts or ideas, and being able to actually critically and meaningfully engage in discourse in a productive way, right? So I kind of think of it I don't know, I grew up playing video games as a kid, and when we think of governance too, I think of MMOs and how a bunch of 15-year-olds can coordinate better than nation states, which is really interesting. But it's kind of like navigating a maze of mini bosses, right? There's each departmental head has a certain weakness or a certain special power, and you have to it's like Dark Souls all over again, nightmares. And so just an obscure reference there maybe, but so yeah, so I think it's one of the major points of transformation for science today is an overarching cultural shift from institutions that place people in positions to run with their ideas and become highly, highly specialized, but also artifacts of the time in which they existed, right? So they've invented these techniques, they've pushed the field forward, and that exponential burst occurred. And now there's, hundreds, if not thousands of other young people, scientists, students, independent thinkers, right, that aren't even maybe in the academic system, that are pushing the envelope. And that bottleneck kind of are these individuals that are holding on to that knowledge, and they have that a certain bandwidth. Even if they want to give back, they might not be able to, right? Because they can't handle that. So the solution to that are open source autonomous protocols like LabDAO, for example, where anyone can be able to access these resources in a way that lets them take their research to the next level. So I see the open science movement, which kind of really took a lot of these ideas from and movement philosophies from open source. Scientists that do their research on GitHub, hell yeah, like that's the way that you do it. Everything is transparent, it's out there, it's re-executable. And I just want to plug one project out there called DataLad, which has been pushing people into subliminally using SVN and Git version control for their scientific research projects without them really realizing it, by offering them the ability to access reproducible environments, right? And so scientists have had to learn Git to use DataLad to get access to data and reproduce results, which has been pretty awesome. I plugged LabDAO, so maybe you have more to say on that.
Yeah, just on the Git point, I sometimes joke when I talk to the core team that even if LabDAO fails, I'm going to be extremely happy that I taught everybody how to use GitHub to like coordinate around like a shared truth, because I do think that's very much at the heart of what science is supposed to be as well. So yes, science, the way that we know it, it definitely has its deficits, but I think at the core, when we think about science, it's the idea of someone that's creative taking ownership in their work, but sharing the result extremely freely. And that's a sort of paradox that sets it apart from free markets. And Web3 in that sense is actually one step beyond, one step further, taking this to the more extreme. Everything's open source. I can go to Etherscan, I can see everything, all the smart contracts are open, but you have complete ownership. It's very clear that this is yours. So in a way, I think culturally, these two things are way more related than we think they are. And it's just sort of getting through that mimetic hump that we have to now achieve. And the idea of, I tend to, when I talk to scientists, I tend to talk to them about not like token-based payments, I say open source payments. Like, this is an open source payment system. There's no like Stripe or PayPal or credit card information. This is open source. Like, you can see this is the code that's being run. It's actually, yeah, you get paid in code. It's actually, like, and then it's sort of, I hope it works better for them. But yeah, so I think the idea of like opening up the tool that you've built while having actually a really good way to track that you've built it is like, that's what science is all about. And I'm actually really optimistic about it. And it's just really, we just need to build useful tools. Like, we just need to just give it a couple more months and we're just going to start building tools that scientists actually do find useful. And that's the number one challenge. The moment that we have something that's useful, people will start listening to us, people will start using the thing, and the moment that we solve a problem that they haven't been able to solve before, yeah, I think it's going to be adopted.
I think like a way in which we try to bridge, at least between on the one hand, the ego question, and on the other hand, also the question of like, how do scientists actually get a bit more upside in it, right? Which is, I think, something that is a little bit like still undervalued to some extent. So at Foresight, we're like building technology trees, which are basically a way in which we map the entire spaces that we service. And so we have these like tech leads out there that interview domain experts on what it is that they're currently working on and how it fits into the larger field. So we have one tech tree for longevity, one for neurotechnology, one for molecular machines, and so forth. And so that, on the one hand, means that these tech leads go out there and ask scientists not the question like, what is currently undervalued in your area, by which everyone always screams, my lab, but also like, what is a challenge that would move your field along that is not particularly related to the individual bit that you're working on, and like that you actually get really good answers, because people, definitely know what enabling tool they need to further their research along. And so I think it's a question of like asking also different questions maybe. And so not really, allowing everyone to just share their own research, which of course we know is super important, but also, what are different ways in which we can actually move your field along. But then I think it also comes with the flip side. So for example, when we have the challenge, we usually try to put a bounty on it. On the long run, you could imagine a DAO sitting there and actually funding the challenge, and then people can make project proposals to actually solve that particular node on the tech tree. And here, I think the interesting bit is that you also want to give scientists upside, because that's the thing that's really missing still, right? Like oftentimes, you have VCs coming in and funding science, and the due diligence of the scientists is sometimes unpaid. That is crazy, and so like, how can scientists on the one hand, get incentivized to actually tell people like, hey, look, even though my lab is working on this, I actually think this is super important too. I need that too. So how do you make that cut? And then also on the other hand, how do you provide them with upside for having given you that information? And for us, that's usually you can then, for example, like incentivize them of just like paying them or also paying them in equity. But like, I think those mechanisms, I think, are again like tools, or at least mechanism design, and I think we can solve those, but we need to, I think, tread lightly, because I think people still have lots of hard-gained reputation that they can lose. But I think we're trying to do it somewhat with the tech trees, and we have a few domain experts now that we interviewed, and they've given us a few challenges, and we're now figuring out different ways to reward them. We're partnering, for example, with VitaDAO, which of course many core contributors are here to actually give longevity prizes on different fields as a part of these tech tree challenges. At least for us, that's a big use case there, and I think they're just trying to figure out how do we actually incentivize these researchers to provide good due diligence and to actually have them have some skin in the game in the answers that they provide is, I think, an important bit to solve.
No, absolutely. And I believe that, we as DeSci have the possibility to build a platform for better science. And to me, a huge part of the allure of coming into Web3 is better technology. That's why I'm so excited about the experimentation and people just being out here building things, is because you actually can create some incredible pieces of tech that can actually help scientists. Most people who go into academia understand that it's not going to be millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. They're brilliant minds who could do very well in industry if they were motivated as such, but decide to pursue knowledge instead. So helping them on that quest is going to be critically important for us, and building the platforms that they can do that through. So I would say a focus on building is probably a big part of Web 2 to Web 3. Another aspect that I personally am passionate about is helping to onboard scientists into Web 3 in a safe way. So making sure that they understand the basics of what a wallet is, providing public goods to make sure that they understand never to give away their private keys. And I think that that's something that we as an ecosystem probably need to take a look at some point. One other thing that I did want to mention with regard to this is something I've noticed coming into the space as someone who's not a scientist. It's I guess a strong difference in ideology between science and software. And that's been one that's been really fascinating to work with, because the incentive of software is speed. You want to move fast, you want to build stuff, you want to see if it works, and if it doesn't, build the next thing and move on. In academia, if you publish results that are incorrect or misleading, those results sometimes don't get found out. Replication and reproducibility are a huge issue. Those results don't get found out for sometimes years to come, at which point other people have built on your results time and time again, and the negative impacts of those incorrect findings have propagated throughout the system. So software is focused on speed. Academia is focused on precision. And there is a legitimate need for both of those in the individual space. I think it's going to be very interesting to see the way that the two areas kind of come together and work to understand each other. So at DeSci Labs, we have a development arm, DeSci Labs, and then we have our more academic arm, which is DeSci Foundation. Because there is something to be said for, you know, the actual group that's building being focused on speed, and the group that's performing science or facilitating science being focused on accuracy. So having a split between those two actually could be an interesting example and solution there. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. And I think it's interesting to hear and to kind of think about certain elements of, as Shadi, as you were describing, kind of that learning journey into becoming a scientist and how much you rely on open source, open knowledge, you know, other people's published research, open code libraries, code bases, Stack Overflow, Reddit, I know is a great resource for everyone if you find the right subs. But at a certain point, it seems as though in the career of a scientist, and obviously there's like personality and culture differences, but in general, like as you're going through it, at a certain point, you start building enough on all of this pre-existing knowledge that you're like, ooh, I have unique thoughts. I have things not yet represented there. And that's where the incentive game starts being thorny, where it's like, well, what is my actual incentive to immediately go kick that back into the commons? Or do I sit on this and figure out a way how to capture something, whether it's my tenure, trying to get a tenureship at an academic institution, whether it's, top publishing at whatever journals or conferences. And I know I was recently catching up with a former roommate of mine who's a material scientist, postdoctoral researcher, and he was telling me, he's like, after X years of working with his advisor, he's like, I finally had the realization, he never tells me a freaking idea. He only takes my ideas and like puts it in the context of other things he knows we've talked about, but he never actually tells me his unique ideas. Because what is his incentive to release that down and not just keep capturing that flow up? So this is a really long-winded way of leading up to the question of what are the actual value adds that Web3 can provide to scientists that will break that incentive flow, that will make them want to kick more right into the community and be a good team player, for lack of a more nuanced way.
It's I was laughing to myself when you were kind of saying, oh, finally somebody came up with this unique idea, after years of study and apprenticeship. And it's just hilarious to me because the universe is so vast that our puny human brains have to work so hard to come up with something that's novel, that hasn't been described yet before, right? And it just baffles me that the most common fear I encountered as a graduate student was the fear of getting scooped, that somebody was gonna take your stupid experiment and its results and go win a Nobel Prize with it. And everybody believed that, right? Like, they were onto something. And so I never got that. And like, I was always kind of, in the corner over there, I was like, nobody really cares. It's probably wrong. You should just publish it or post it or talk about it, stop being so secretive. You're not getting anywhere that way. And it's just crazy that when people finally stumble upon some feeling of creativity or some feeling of, I guess, like, oh, wow, I actually had an original thought or an original, and it is difficult, I don't want to understate it. It can be very difficult. But I think it's because of the thought patterns that we create in our training that really kind of mold us to didactically work through a problem in a certain school of thought or with a certain set of habits or reflexes, right? And sometimes it's gut reflexes. And I also think that it's because really highly specialized fields don't talk to other people as much as they should be. As a scientist, you're working in a very solitary manner, and when it comes down to the wire, you're the one who's writing the paper. Even though there's going to be 5 other authors on it, there's usually one person who kind of writes the paper first and gets everybody else to get on it. Maybe you iterate over it. And so I think the number one thing that Web3 has to offer to scientists is, number one, people. Being able to break out of your lab and work in an open, engaging, socially intelligent way where you're actually applying, those other not unused parts of your brain, but that other bandwidth that you have, paying attention to people and paying attention to what they say. And, not just like a weekly journal club or something, but where every step along the way, someone's telling you, no, you're wrong, it needs to be this way, and you have a whole governance fight about it maybe, but you both come out of it the better, a little bit wiser. So I think that's number one. And I think number two, I would have to say is, I guess it's probably cultural or maybe philosophical. It's embracing the anarchy or the chaos, right? So I think like the ability to, where it's not so much in a stream or in like a particular school, it feels like things are new again, right? Like it's not the field of neuroscience as, established by Ramoni Cajal and now, wherever we're at today. So I think that's number two. And then number three, I think, is the ability, like everyone else was saying, Eric and Allison, Nicholas, everyone here, is experimentation with novel incentive structures where we can create, and kind of coming back to the software and science, like it's going to merge. Software and science are going to come together. We don't know how that's going to be, and there's tons of problems to solve before that happens. But when that software and science merges, is it going to be a Facebook software, or is it going to be a Linux software? Is it going to be a protocol that's owned by the people that actually maintain it? And what does the incentive structure look like for that? Is the protocol going to be set up in a way that it only survives if people are working in an open, collaborative manner? And if it dies, the cost is too high, right? So people have to work collaboratively, or else this protocol that archives all of our work, that creates our knowledge graph, that guarantees availability of resources for compute or whatever, if that goes away, then we can't do science anymore. Maybe our society can't survive anymore. So maybe setting ourselves up and taking lessons from life, and making sure our mitochondria are these open source protocols that without them we'd be dead.
Well put. There are two thoughts I have on the question of like holding back versus sharing freely. I think really generally the culture and the world that we live in today is highly influenced by the information technology that is accessible for us. And I think information technology is probably the most relevant form of technology when it comes to changing the way that people interact and changing culture. So thinking of culture as a function of information technology sometimes helps me. And when we think through the academic process the way that we both probably got to know it, and everybody else that worked in an academic department, you work in your project and you gather information and you start to form it, and you're in this sort of very sometimes outdated feeling process of gathered information. Then maybe in 2 years' time we're going to write it up into a manuscript, and then we're going to sign it with our name, and then we're going to publish it through these like very traditional means. And the internet as an information technology is completely changing the rules of the game. I can tweet something and I sign it with my name. It's like signed, or I can do a transaction on chain and I sign it cryptographically, and it's just very clear that this is my work. And I think that the sort of time to signature is the number one driver that is about to change the whole academic culture. When the time to signature is completely trusted, you need to go through the publisher and you need to write the whole article in order to sign it and then publish it through the traditional means, then you are way more incentivized to keep secrets. But when everything is out in the open and the velocity in which you can share something, because the time to signing is so short, I could literally live tweet the signs I do every day, or I can like cryptographically sign it and point it to my wallet, and just everybody would know, yeah, that was the science that Nicholas was doing. And if I'm just a scientist and I'm not even interested in sort of getting some upside because I really just love open source, then actually that's like a valid career strategy. I'm just like gonna live tweet every day like how my cells are doing, because it's always clear that this was what I did. And I think that's what a lot of like people used to be afraid about when scooping was a thing, because the time to signature was so long, was so delayed. Another point that you touched and that I wanted to jump on last time you asked a question, I think another thing that the internet changes is exits, like your ability to exit. Like if you're in a lab where the PI is like extremely power concentrating, that's not great, especially if there's no way to exit. Within Web3, if you don't like the vibe in a particular team within the DAO, you just say, no, I'm going to join the other team, it's fine. Yeah, it's like I just fork, or I just join another group. I do not believe that the way that we do science is going to end up in sort of this complete I guess it's sort of an anarchism slash like chaos. I do think that there will be principal investigators that are extremely highly regarded, and you, as a young, talented future scientist, you talk to that person and they make a decision about whether they want to work with you, take you on as a student, you're going to train with them. But maybe you're not only going to train with them, maybe you're also like doing a 20% stint with that other great scientist that decided to work with you, and you're working on different open source projects, and your time to signature is extremely low, so you just earn these badges of contribution to a particular scientific product every day. And then if one of these PIs you're working with sort of starts to defect on you in some way, then you just say, all right, I'm just gonna switch my attention to this other project, and it's way more graceful to transition. So I think that's how culture will change, just as a function of the information protocols that we use.
I think what you said is really interesting, because when people talk about the difference between like competition and cooperation, like oftentimes you compete by trying to compete on being better at cooperating with others. And I think on the long run, that there is this, I think really like healthy development of an ecosystem, because, if you can move somewhere else and just become better at cooperating with them, I think that's all good. Just as a meta point, I think you're totally right in this, and that's why I think the fluidity and interoperability is key. I think if you actually like look at the tools, like what does Web3 have to offer scientists, like Research Hub, for example, is awesome, because, people can actually go and do their I always usually pitch it like, a Twitter for like, different research papers where like new journals organically form. So you can actually work on the thing that you think is important. You can have peer review bubbles that like form around new different topics, that weren't previously possible, right? Like I think obviously like it's really fantastic, and like creating very new mechanisms by which people don't have to fit their research into the mold that they were given, but they can actually just break out and actually do the types of collaborations that are usually you have to go through 3 different academic departments, and like you have to like finagle the people, and you have to write a grant proposal that never really gets anywhere because there's no incentive mechanism for it. And so I think by actually just doing what you'd like to do, if there wasn't a mold for it, I think that's the number one thing that we can bring to researchers. And, I guess, like, and then also being able to just actually being able to execute on it using something like LabDAO, and actually saying like, hey, who here out there is able to like actually produce to me the type of thing that I want to build right now. I think like actually just allowing them to do what they would like to do if it wasn't for the structures that they were being pressed in, I think is the number one thing. And then on the flip side, you also have the funders, right? Like I think like a really big thing of like why isn't much more funded that should happen is like the type of coordination game that exists between researchers not being able to slot, or like researchers having to slot into different molds, but then also funders not really knowing what they could fund if it wasn't for the types of molds that were being presented for them. And so there's now really interesting bits like impact certificates, for example, where people can kind of signal that they were very early on in funding something that then turned out to be very impactful later on, and actually being able to get kickback profits for that. And there's a new nonprofit out there, Impact Certificates, and they incentivize that, being early and funding something that is maybe super strange and still really quite out there. And you could imagine a world in which even IP NFTs that VitaDAO is working on could also have a secondary value of turning into impact certificates. And so actually allowing funders to kind of signal that they were very early on and funding something that is super strange, like cryonics research, whatever. And so through that, being able to allow them to also fund a little bit more what they would actually like to do if it wasn't for the molds that they were being presented. So breaking it away on both of these layers is, I think, what Web3 tooling is really great at. Just being more experimental in that regard.
I love experimental. Yes, honestly, that is a huge part of what all this comes down to. I think that the technology behind Web3 is going to be a huge thing that we can actually give to scientists. And it does come down to this experimental build mode kind of vibe. But right now, the current front end of science is a PDF. It is a solitary PDF that has not been changed since the 1990s. There's so much more that goes into an experiment. There's data, there's code, there's videos. You can make reproducible code dockers that can actually be run on, excuse me, on some kind of platform by anyone with access to it. I think access is going to be another huge piece that can actually be given to scientists. So in creating a lot of these technological systems, I think we can work to redesign some of the way that science works on the back end, and that there's a lot of power behind that.
Absolutely, and I see that we are getting dangerously close to the end of our panel here. I know we had a late start to it, but I see the next panel, I think, is already slowly getting assembled, so we will keep the timing on track. But I do just want to thank all of the panelists who joined today. As Eric mentioned, we have a whole DeSci Day tomorrow, which is just going to be a bunch of projects in the space highlighting the work that they're doing, as well as having a few panel discussions. So yeah, we're really excited to get that going. We have a whole Telegram-based community and some other stuff that you can get involved with. And long story short, if you want to get more involved in hearing what's going on, feel free to come talk to any of us and we'll gladly point you in the right direction. And I was hoping we were going to have enough time to potentially invite someone, because I know there's a bunch of VitaDAO crew folks here today to give an update from their side, but we have less than a minute left, so that doesn't feel like a fair amount of time. But yeah, there's folks representing all our projects, and VitaDAO at least has a variety of different DeSci players here. So yeah, just thank you all again to the panelists, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Yay. That worked. Hello, friends. We're going to talk about DAOs and governance and exciting things. This is also exciting, though. Humans and healing is also very important. Sick. All right. So there's like not many humans here, and there's 80 minutes that we're meant to have on this panel. So like it can be as inclusive as we all want, and literally just like yell shit, and we can all argue, and we'll make it fun. What the name of the panel is how do we move past single delegate plutocracies? So Vitalik tweeted today, being like, coin voting is always shit, and it will never work, which is actually very accurate. And the fact that like all of our wealth, a lot of it, is tied in these systems, where actually by having a shitload of money means that you run the world, is actually like kind of lame. And so this panel is talking about how we can move past just having like single tokens being the governance weight and sort of move into a new, crazier reality, whether it be through communication platforms or through NFTs or through scanning eyeballs or through or through sort of creating new infrastructure. What are the ways that we can actually move past that? So without that, I'll kick it over to Ivan and we'll do some intros.
Awesome, thanks. I'm Ivan. I'm doing memes and vibes at Aragon. Part of the council there of the DAO, and also doing ecosystem within the association.
Hey, what's up? I'm Thiago. I'm right now head of product at WorldCoin. Yeah, looking forward to talking about it.
Hey, what's up? I'm Will, CEO, co-founder, Element Finance. We recently launched a new governance protocol called Council Protocol. We're also a DeFi platform. So, yeah.
Hey, I'm George. I'm the head of business and operations for Commonwealth. So we build end-to-end DAO tooling, everything from DAO launching to actually facilitating discussion and governance votes. Yeah.
So, if we do want to move past a world of all using tokens to govern everything, then what is the best way to do it? Should it be based on being a real human? Should it be based on sort of your participation in the platform on sort of a technical smart contract level? Should it be about like the way that you communicate about proposals or governance in a wider format? What does everyone think of like if you were building the perfect governance system that wasn't a half-broken democracy like we have in the political way, or a plutocracy like we have in the crypto way? What is the best solution?
I wish I knew. Yeah, it's. I think one of the cool things that we have in crypto space is that we can think of experiments and then we let people do it with their money. So there is I personally have like an evolutionary view of at some point we'll figure it out and it will just become hopefully the dominant way protocols and projects and DAOs are being run. At the moment, I think both purely financial capital contribution through coins, but also purely human-based like voting are both broken, because ultimately the more you contribute towards a common enterprise, the more say you should have on how it evolves. It just this contribution shouldn't just be tied to like how much money you pumped in it. Like there are a lot of other meaningful ways to contribute towards the project.
Yeah, I think that the answer is it depends, right? It depends what you're trying to govern. I'm a big fan of the idea of just splitting out a DAO into a bunch of fractals and just governing each part in a different way, right? So there are certain decisions that you should make one person, one vote. There are certain decisions that you should be based on how much you've been contributing in terms of reputation. And there's other things where you honestly just want to point one person and say, like, he will make the decisions in this scope, right? Or a committee. And so I think in general, there's all of these primitives, right? And obviously, I really think that unique humanness is a common thread behind all of this, because even if you're doing something like reputation, you want to make sure that's not gameable. But at the end of the day, we just have to be really flexible and just look at what problem we're facing and then figuring out the best solution for that.
Yeah, so I guess to restate some of the problems, so you mentioned something which is cool, which maybe, one person, one vote doesn't entirely do it, right? But also token voting, just like a financial-based voting model, probably doesn't do it either. So maybe there's something in between to explore, right? So in a financial voting system where it's based on the tokens that you hold, and there's some value to those tokens, there's been a lot of issues in the space. So I know if you talk, for example, to people who are working at MakerDAO and who are very involved in governance there, one thing you'll hear a lot is there's some people who are very, very strong in the community. They're very involved in the governance system there, strong advocates for the direction of things. And or they're strong contributors on GitHub and other aspects, but they don't have a large voting say in the protocol. So they get involved in governance, but their vote doesn't really matter. And so you have people who hold a large token share. Some of them just sit there passively, don't do anything. The token shares used as collateral on Aave or Compound or something. They don't even pull it out of that platform to go and vote. They sort of sit there passively and they're not involved. And so that's one broken mechanism. Or you have someone who holds a large amount of tokens, and AKA we can call them a whale as an example. And they don't really take the time to look at the people who are driving the direction of the protocol. They're putting in the work and putting in the sweat. And so they go in and they sort of vote in directions that based on tokens. If it's just based on the financial side of things, you don't have a good distribution of voting power. And so like how can you solve that? And so a really cool thing to discuss and talk about is essentially how do you give voting power to people who are active in the community, to GitHub contributors, to people that are involved in care, and it's not just based on the token and financial side of things. So that's how I'd sort of restate the problem. Yeah.
We have 80 minutes, so I'm just going to wing it. Yeah, it's actually funny because token distribution is the thing that we've done the longest since ERC20 became a thing, and we still are pretty bad at it. So I think part of fixing is because to your point, in some cases pure token-based governance would make sense, but for that to work well, we have to fix the token distribution part of it, and also we have to again personal view, but we have to stop penalizing people who participate in governance by removing their ability to generate yield. So Element 5 have this cool thing, which is voting votes. Yeah, where if you're an LP, you can still vote, which a lot of the more traditional frameworks didn't allow, and then you're missing on yield to be able to participate in the governance, which creates sort of cost to governance, and that's a penalty for being a diligent participant.
Yeah, to sort of add in there, so I definitely agree with a lot of the sentiments said so far, especially the idea of using fractal governance designs. And so it's should we use one person, one vote, one token, one vote, multi-sig, et cetera? I think you need a blend of it based on the situation. And I think one token, one vote, while it has its flaws, I think the real problem comes more into delegation. And so if you're an early stage project, there's a lot of value from raising money from Andreessen. The problem you get down the line is they then control 5 to 20% of your voting power. And so how do you actually include their financial incentivization so that way you can grow, but remove the adverse effects of the governance control that they'll take? And I think through that, you see delegation works pretty well. And one of the sort of ambitions that we're pushing forward with Commonwealth is helping create more common interest voting delegates as group. And so you can start to have, say you're a member of FireEyes, or you respect FireEyes in the space, you can start to delegate your token to FireEyes as a voter. And then similarly, any other DAO you're a part of. So if you're in DXDAO or Redacted or whatnot, you can start to give your voting power to that specific DAO, and then they can accumulate voting power across a number of protocols and have a team who's responsible for doing this research. And I think that's something that's really missing right now, because most of the delegates, it's you're looking for professional delegates or blockchain clubs, or just sort of influencers or whales in the space. And so I think definitely fleshing out a better delegate system will help improve a lot of the governance problems we see with one token, one vote.
Yeah, +1. And I think that's one of the things we've been trying to do with Wildfire, but it admittedly is hard, to do, right? And that's, I think, one of the reasons that there's very few groups that are governing, right? That the groups that are governing right now are university clubs or funds, and that is the only people that are, and a couple of single, shout out Simona for being the #1 delegate inside of ENS and Gitcoin. But there are so few humans actually doing this that how can we create groups of people that actually have the resourcing and the time and the analysts and all of those things to actually be able to participate in governance. So with that, do we think that is there any use case where you want one token, one vote? That's what all systems use, but is it just always shit?
I would say for major changes to an underlying protocol, you probably do want one token, one vote. While I do think, plutocracies don't work well, but I think with the right governance mechanism, you can ensure that the protocol is being designed for those larger groups. And I think especially when you're drastically changing a protocol, it makes sense to really allocate based off of, stake in the game. I think you can potentially tie in some other voting schemes as well, but generally I think, you have to respect your shareholders.
I
Yeah.
think, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I think actually, I think when you think about sub DAOs, it makes a ton of sense, right? So let's say you have a treasury sub DAO, and that treasury sub DAO is in charge of how to allocate a certain allocation of that treasury, say to certain activities, or there's a community sub DAO that is managing its own treasury to throw events and parties or things that brings the community in. I think in situations like that, it could make sense. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about, when specifically does the one vote, yeah.
I think there is a very traditional use case where a lot of DAOs are still just investment clubs. And so when it comes to pooling, when the main contribution capital is financial capital, it makes sense to stick to one token, one vote, because the more tokens you've purchased, the more financial capital you've contributed, probably you have a direct incentive to have high degree of relevant context to what the money is going to be spent on, and hence it makes sense to just stick to a one token, one vote.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And there are some cases where it's in between, and you can just slap quadratic voting on it, right? I think that is always a really interesting compromise where you do want to recognize the people that have a bigger vested interest or the people that have contributed more, but not in an outsized way, right? And so if you're able to have proper civil resistance, which in the context of smaller DAOs is a lot easier, right, than governing really big things, I think quadratic voting really gives you the best of both worlds for that.
And so if it wasn't going to be one token, one vote, what about if we sort of went round and said, let's say we're governing random XYZ DAO, and depending on how much engagement I had on the Commonwealth platform, that gave me a multiplier, right? Depending on how many times I'd interact with that platform, that gave me another multiplier. If I was, had proven I was a real human using WillCoin, that gives me another multiplier. Depending on how much I've used Aragon, that gives me another multiplier. And sort of you end up with having, your address that has 40 different multipliers on it, and that could mean that your vote goes from one token, one vote to one token, 40 votes, depending on actually how much you've engaged in a different platform.
I think that could potentially be a future we end up with. There is no way we can engineer it from now. We have to start, basically having that much complexity cannot be engineered from the start. It has to progressively layer on top of each other, and some of this stuff is not gonna work. Some DAOs are gonna die because of that, or dissolve because of that. But we have the luxury of just being here and philosophizing about it, which is pretty cool. And other people would and we will participate in some of those experiments, but ultimately it's not something that we can solve by talking about it. I think it's a matter of experimentation.
So we're actually playing with this right now in a few ways. So I'll talk about it. Voting vaults is one of them, and then we're doing some other cool things around some reputational standards, things like that. So voting vaults is Element Finance. We released a new governance protocol. It's called the Counts Protocol. We built it from the ground up, so it has built-in delegation and this concept, we like to call them governance Lego pieces. They're essentially these voting vaults. And what a voting vault does is when a vote is presented, the governance system basically queries these different voting vaults that governance launches to determine what your individual voting power is. And so what it does is it essentially reconstitutes the definition of a vote. It's not just tied to the amount of tokens that you have. And so to give some simple examples, for example, the team, all our tokens are locked in what we call a vesting vault. So it's actually the opposite. Instead of having more voting power, we've put our voting power at a 5% multiplier. So we only have 5% of the total voting power that we would normally have. We take this to a number of other examples. So like one is if you hold the token of another DAO, for example, you could create a voting vault that gives you, let's say, a 50% multiplier in voting power. So this is sort of this concept you could introduce, like a DAO merger by doing this. An example that seems to click with people is this idea of a vampire vault. So vampire vault is when you take the token of another DAO and you burn it. And it's like proof of burn. So when you burn their token, you suddenly have voting power in, let's say the, council governance protocol in this case. So let's say there's a competitor DAO, you have everyone burn the token, and now they can actually vote in your system. You give them, allocate a voting power. And so this is essentially the concept of, these voting vaults. You can reconstitute them. And so one of the things that we're playing with is how do we create a voting vault that rewards GitHub contributors, right? And we did like an early experimentation with this. So in our token, voting power drop that we did, we actually, did a analysis of, core Ethereum 1, Ethereum 2 developers in the ecosystem, and also like sister protocols, things like Commonwealth and other protocols. And we looked at anyone who contributed to the GitHub, merged a PR, got a commit into the main branch. They were able to claim voting power, and they could do it in a way where they weren't doxxed. We did this, zero knowledge claim flow, and they suddenly had, voting power in the system. So that was our early experimentation. And so what we're sort of wanting to play with now with these voting vaults is how do you create an identity around these GitHub contributors and say community contributors? And how do you create a voting vault where they can prove that they stake in this voting vault, and now they have a boosted or significant voting power without having to hold the actual token. And now this means that these players who are extremely important to the protocol but might not have, for example, the same financial means as others can still have a strong say in the direction, can still vote as part of that. So I won't continue to ramble on too long because I can talk about this all day, and I can say about how this is in practice, but I'll let the conversation sort of go there naturally. But these are some of the things that we've been working on and innovating on and playing with. And actually, on Commonwealth, there's cool ways to plug that in that we're excited about too. So.
And on the Commonwealth point, have you thought about I think everyone and their dog is talking about building DAO tooling at the moment, right? It's like, oh, we need DAO tooling. But actually, what that actually looks like is a lot more complex than it actually is. But, if you have different DAO platforms and you can sort of have some level of on-chain reputation, which might be transactions, but it might also be engagement, right? If you've commented 50 times, if you've been upvoted 1 million times, whatever it might be that actually gives you governance weight. Have you guys thought at all about that?
Yeah, 100%. So we definitely are looking to build out reputation standards based off of cross-chain interactions. So especially if, it's most people are a part of probably about 10 to 30 tokens or hold that many. And so if you're active in this many different communities, you want to be able to first sort of see someone's history across all of the communities. So what are they saying? What are they saying in Aave? What are they saying in Compound? What are they voting? Are they actually voting in line with what they're saying in these forums? And right now, there's none of this transparency. So sort of our first step is really bringing that transparency to the forefront. From there, you can then build out these profiles even further to include different reputational standards in terms of, exactly your comments, posts, upvotes, proposals created and passed. And you can start to get a really good idea of, who are active contributors, who's actually really adding value. And then from there, protocols themselves can choose if they want to start to utilize these metrics as either governance multipliers, using it for like yield boosts, and so on. From there, we'll definitely be incorporating it into sort of the future growth of our platform. Can't say too much about it right now, but more to come.
I think like now the panel is actually going to get controversial, because I think like this was also like the first time I started thinking about reputation. I was like, okay, like in normie land, like if a politician votes as they say they vote, that builds good reputation. So maybe like the history of previous votes is a good basis to like build your reputation as a good governor, right? But then another important aspect, and I love that you mentioned the ZK claim, is some people in some organizations don't want everyone on the planet to know how they voted, right? So then it gets into this, like, how do you balance the right of people for privacy and the need for transparency in organizations?
I mean, I would say, if you're trying to not be private, like, you shouldn't use blockchain. I think a lot of these different votes are very public and out there. We personally believe that the transparency behind it is how you can actually ensure good community development and prevent against either people that are just trying to pump their bags and bad actors, and you can't really come to that decision if you don't have the transparency. On the note though of helping people conceal identity, on our platform, you can choose what you set your username and stuff to. So if you're looking to be active but not maybe dox your main wallet, it's just a matter of create a different wallet, delegate to that wallet. But I think the individual wallets that are doing contributions, there should be transparency into what's going on.
Yeah, it's a really good question, this balance between privacy and trust. I think that pseudonyms are a good balance between those two. This is the way we do things at WorldCoin is when we issue a proof of personhood that is not attached to a wallet, right? You have a separate private key, and that is your proof of personhood, and then you can have as many wallets as you want. And so you can perform actions with whatever wallet you want today, but only once, right? And so the rest of the world doesn't know that behind all of these wallets, there's just one person, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of systems like this where you will have a lot of identities from people so that they can act in the different points of view that they want, right? So if someone wants to say something but then vote a different way, they might do it through different identities. But at the end of the day, I do think it is valuable for any one of those identities to be consistent within themselves, right? And so the privacy you get from not doxing who else you are online, but all of these personas do have to be consistent with themselves, right? Because we're humans and we need to be able to trust each of these individual personas. So that's I think, it's a good balance.
Yeah, I like the idea of the pseudonym side, right? It doesn't actually necessarily go to a real world identity. But there are cases, I do think, where privacy is important. Maybe there are certain votes where privacy is key, and so you have a commit reveal period, or you use zero knowledge proofs, or you do things like that. I know you guys played around with the commit reveal at one point, some things like that. So I was even I was in a workshop yesterday where we were exploring some problems in DAOs and different solutions, and we were thinking, do you reward people who generally are voting for proposals that end up passing, they seem to be on point? Things like that, only work though if there's a privacy aspect, right? Because otherwise you just vote with the herd. But real quick, I want to sort of change the discussion a little bit, because you mentioned something which on Commonwealth, sort of what you want to do is look at people who are commenting, who are upvoting, who are active, and how do you take that and do a multiplier? And so I'm a huge believer in that. I think that's really cool. You can build a reputation around that, but it also presents another problem, which is vote farming or vote mining. So once you start putting criteria by which users can sort of build a reputation, get stronger vote, and then essentially get better incentives, then you find bots go and start mindlessly doing these activities, and they game the system. how do you prevent that? Like, same thing even like with GitHub contributions, right? Now, someone, instead of squashing their commits, they do like 20, commits and try and do that as like to increase their contribution count or things like that. So I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm curious if like what you've thought about regarding it.
Yeah. So I mean, generally, you're spot on. I think moderation becomes really important, and we already see this with like airdrop whitelists, with like Discords, and generally like community management, where you have certain managers that help limit and prevent spam. And so I think with that, you'll see a similar resolution where Commonwealth as like a decentralized platform doesn't necessarily want to do the moderation ourselves, but we actually want to empower all of the communities to moderate themselves. And so with that, they will then have voting power in order to blacklist bad actors from the platform. So if certain accounts are being created that are doing bad actions, immediately will get like blacklisted from that community. And then similarly, you can then also have different communities on the platform vote if a specific community is a bad actor. Say there's like a fake Uniswap that pops up and it's just very clearly not Uniswap. They're trying to like, I don't know, do some random stuff. The rest of the communities, Element, DYDX, Redacted, et cetera, could all come together and be like, hey, this one community is bad for the total platform. We should get rid of them. And so having multiple levels of moderation and sort of governance within your governance platform, I think is like definitely important for limiting all of the spam.
I think that on top of that, I mean, moderation is obviously very important, but when you think about it, it's the same problem that we have to deal with airdrops, right? The reason airdrops are retroactive is because if you announce the incentives up front, people just go and farm them, right? This is the same problem that you would have here. And so really it comes down to the case, if you ask me, right? Like when you make one comment, that should give you 5 tokens, but your 10th comment shouldn't also give you 5 comments, right? And so what you can do if you have, in cases like this, right, or let's say that you're talking about organizations, right, you're talking about each individual clubs and how they participate, right? It's really easy to know that there's only like one Harvard crypto club. And so the way you reward that club should be on a curve, right? It should not be linear. And so what that guarantees, it incentivizes people to participate, but it just de-incentivizes abuse, right? Because you just stop getting rewards the more and the more you participate.
So just to go on that quickly, I generally agree, but almost in the opposite way. I don't think your first comment should give you like 5 votes. I think your first comment should give you 0 votes. I think your second one should probably also give you 0 votes. And I think maybe your 50th comment, you actually get 5 votes. And then maybe it's like your 100th, you get 10. And so generally the way I sort of think about these like vote allocation is like in stepwise curves. And so especially within communities, you're gonna have a lot of lurkers who come in, maybe they leave a comment, maybe they leave an upvote. You're gonna get people that are trying to farm. So like also how do you give yourself enough time in order to catch them before they can actually do any real damage in terms of vote? So with that, you can also include like how long have you been in the community beyond just even like when, or like how many actions you have. And so with this, you can begin to identify sort of low-level contributors, lurkers, medium-level contributors, and then like your super contributors that are like on your like forum every single day. They vote on every single proposal. They've been around for like a year and a half. And it's like you want to reward that kind of contribution. And so beginning to break this down more into like personas and how that fits into a stepwise, I think is the right way versus doing just like a quadratic curve.
Just a request for the fellow panelists, let's speak slower because we have another 50 minutes to fill. This like predates even our space, but as soon as a metric becomes a signal, it's going to be gamed. And so I think for that, to prevent that, basically, in perpetuity, there's going to be some soft, iffy element to this that relies on things that we can perceive uniquely as human beings. And basically, it's not going to be an algorithm of like if you come up with an algorithm of how to get more governance power, it will be gamed.
I think like part of it is that like we have to have those experiments. So I think like I'm super, and actually like that's a super fucking dope proposal. The idea that like you have a forum and there needs to be some validation. Obviously you can't just say like A 500 times, but like assuming you've had like enough upvotes, if you've had one with 10 upvotes, you get nothing, but if you get 10 or 100, then you actually suck in your reward. Like someone should just do that. We should just make that a proposal now and just implement it in it, because that's a fucking cool idea. And like it would be, I mean, let's do it.
Let's do it.
And like, I think it will be gamed, but like that's okay. And like let it be gamed and like see what the outcomes are, because I think like we don't know how these incentives play out in bot land yet. And I think like even the bots, if the bot ends up being useful, sweet.
I agree with this. Like, just try it out. Bots will definitely figure out a way to game, but you won't figure that out unless you try it out, and then you continue to do that, because you can't just do retro rewards for things like this that need to be continuous forever, right? Eventually, you have to create a system, and you have to create a system that probably combines some human identity aspect with moderation, and then in this case, sort of the identity aspect is building up your reputation over time. And I think the stepwise function, that's really cool, because if someone spins up a new identity and like their first comment is 50 votes, then and you do it on a curve where over time it decreases. If you do it that route, that becomes really problematic, because then you're basically incentivizing people to just spin up new accounts, and so doing this reputation over time is is a really cool way to do it. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of just like put the proposal out there. Let's try it. Let's see.
As soon as we're done getting fucked up in Amsterdam, I'll be there.
I think it's cool.
So like changing up slightly then and going back to what we're talking about privacy, what do we think about the idea of like, should you be able to vote privately? Like it's a really interesting discussion, and it sort of came up through recently with the stuff that went on with ENS of like and sort of the Brantley situation of like how people want to vote or morally think they should vote versus them being scared of being called out for voting a certain way. I think my stance on it is that actually like they all need to be transparent 100% of the time, and people just need to bite that bullet. But like, there's also some very good arguments to why some votes should be private. What do we think?
It's okay, so it's actually really interesting. Like the premise of modern democracy is like private voting, right? Like I go to the ballot box, and I have complete privacy. My vote isn't published anywhere. What like president, what senator, whoever I voted with. And it's really interesting because in stark contrast, the existing system of governance in blockchain is actually the opposite. You don't have privacy. And I think that's largely in part because giving privacy is really difficult to do currently. So I do think there are cases where privacy matters. So I actually think the case of electing someone, right? Electing a council member or electing a representative or something like that, having your privacy could be good. When you're voting on how to spend a budget, I think not having privacy is probably a feature, not a bug. This prevents corruption. You have accountability to where this treasury is going and to the power you have in your vote. And so I don't know. Almost maybe the way to think about it is in systems that sort of lean towards one vote. One token, one vote, or sorry, one identity, one vote model, maybe privacy makes sense, but in things that are weighted, maybe they don't. But yeah, I think this is like a really interesting topic, and it's cool that it's in contrast with how current societies operate, right?
I think, so as infrastructure builders, we should absolutely create the tools to enable communities to choose that modus operandi for themselves, and then, just put it out there and see what works best. It might make sense for certain communities. It might make sense. It might be like counterproductive for others, and those would dissolve. And we'll see. Like they'll self-select.
Yeah. I mean, philosophically, ironically, coming from me, I would say you always want to err on the side of privacy. I think that you never want to fall in the trap of like giving out too much privacy for functionality, because that's a very dangerous slippery slope. Beyond that, there's also just a practical matter of bribing, right? In the case of voting, when you say all votes should be public, these are very, very valuable decisions. And I think that as these protocols grow, it will become very, very difficult to not have bribing, and it's something that we're going to have to face the real world in. And so if they're going to be public, it should at least be this two-step function so that, or let people change their votes, because that's going to be a huge problem that we're going to face.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, generally, pretty interesting thoughts. Definitely would be curious to see how it works in person or in reality. I think one of the topics I'm most interested in with that is how would that affect voter turnout as well as hitting quorum. Because I feel like there are a lot of people where a vote's 99% yes or no, but it needs to hit 10% quorum, and so then you get a lot of people that are just throwing on their vote so that way they can help it pass in that way. Whereas if you have it as a private vote, you don't necessarily know where it stands. Maybe you also haven't read up on the vote, so you don't know which way you should be voting. Yeah, and so I think probably if we end up going a private route, we also have to rethink some of the ways that we're actually structuring the votes themselves.
Okay, tell a quick story about bots. so we were talking about bots earlier, and how you present these new solutions, and then people figure out how to game them. Sometimes they don't just game them. Sometimes they do they grief you. They try and grief you in some way, and this is what's cool about trying things out. You get to create solutions that are resilient, right, to bot activity. So. We had fun, so one Saturday night, so we did this ZK claim process, essentially. So we rewarded GitHub contributors across the ecosystem. So we had a list of GitHub IDs, and essentially what you could do is we had this issue thread on GitHub. So if you went into this issue thread, basically when you generated your public-private key through the zero-knowledge claim process, you generate randomness, you post your public ID. Later when you claim your voting power, you can't be doxxed, and this is sort of the process. But you had to be on this white list of GitHub IDs to claim. And so we opened up this issue thread, and you'd go into the issue thread and you'd post this public ID that you generated. And then later, a week later, you can actually do the claim for the voting power. And so what ended up happening is I think someone started trolling us, and this is how our system ended up adapting. We had all these brand new GitHub accounts that weren't whitelisted, so they wouldn't have gotten anything, so it made no sense, that just showed up, and on these issue threads, they started posting random public IDs. And so it started happening, and I look at my phone, and I'm getting a notification every 5 seconds. I'm like, wow, all these people are going through. This is really cool. All the developers that we whitelisted, they're going to claim their voting power. I'm so excited. But then I keep getting the notifications over and over again. So then I log in, I'm like, okay, we have a bot attack. The bots are coming. So at first I'm like, okay, it's not a big deal. It's just annoying. It's just spammy, right? Who cares? They're not going to get anything. So I start antagonizing the bots on Twitter, and start talking about it. It's funny. But then we realize there's a comment limit on issue threads. So the comments get to 2,500 and the issue thread closes. And so all of a sudden, people who actually had a valid claim were now griefed. They couldn't go in and put their public ID. So it's 1 in the morning or midnight in USA time, in Eastern time. So we get up and we're like, okay, we need to fix this now because people in Europe need to do their claim. So the first thing we do is we generate a new issue thread. We're like, okay, this is the quick thing. We're going to do an issue thread. So the bots find the new issue thread immediately. And then they start posting even quicker. So we're getting a few comments a second at this point. So then we're like, okay, how do we combat this? So we end up building a bot that deletes their comments. So we'd go in, and anytime an invalid comment would show up, our bot would go in and delete the comment. So they'd post, we delete, they'd post, we delete. We'd prevent it from getting to the 2,500. Then the people who are running the bots got smarter, so they scaled it up. So they ended up beating the speed of our deletions. So it was fun. So we had to end up scaling up our deletion script, and then they scaled up their posting script. Then we had to scale up our deletion script. So we're in this this bot battle. And then we're finally like, okay, someone from Yearn actually gave us like a really good idea. We're like, okay, let's like launch something right now that's like bot resistant. And so instead what we did is instead of commenting on this thread, we had a public gist. And you just fork the gist, and then you delete the gist, the content, and you put your public ID there. And then that was bot resistant. We deployed that, the bot suddenly disappeared. And like, I'm so curious who is trolling us. But what that worked to is we had this system, right, that had a fundamental flaw in it. And by putting it out there and testing it, we were able to see, okay, this is a flaw, and we can deploy a new system that is resilient to this. And this is what's cool about testing these new premises and these new ways, because you figure out ways to make it resilient to the people that are trying to farm or bot.
And I think, like, and there's heaps of examples of this, right? Like, Nick, the founder of ENS, made just before they released the token, I think, or just after, he put up a snapshot vote that said, "Do not vote on the snapshot vote. This is only for bots, whatever you do." And they got like thousands and thousands of votes for like 0.1 ENS token each, or 0.001 ENS token each. And I think like it speaks, and the same as like Twitter, right? There's people that have been sitting up in bot farms in Russia with like 20,000 phones and developing these, personalities that now are 6 years old and actually start to look like real people and can influence politics. And so I think like as we go into like the future of the economy or the world or whatever, actually like continuously running these experiments and like getting feedback, understanding, and then pushing forward, like might be brutal and annoying and like waking up at 12 o'clock at night, but it's like it's going to be required if we want to sort of be able to innovate on like governance and finance in general, because like the bots are going to continue to eat all, but it's like how can we build censorship or Sybil resistance to sort of actually like stop that?
Yeah, exactly. I did a funny tweet. It was I left a techno party to go squash bots. And that party sucked anyways, so it was cool.
So, what's another topic? I have some more topics here. Anyone else got any topics? So, if we want to have, if there is going to be all of these bots and there is going to be all of this chaos, how do we actually do these experiments, right? Like, it's one thing to sort of sit here and ideate on it and talk about it, or actually maybe make a governance proposal on the back of it. But like, what are ways that we can actually encourage more of this experimentation, right? Is it through grants? Is it through like something that Orca Protocol is setting up at the moment? Is this like governance hackathon, right? Do we have any solutions to sort of create this more experimentation? Because as we sort of keep coming back to, that's what we need. But sitting here and saying we need it sort of versus actually executing it.
I'm a bit pro-organic. Like, if people know it's an experiment, it might not work as intended. As like the Schrodinger's cat thing of like, observing it, observing like the participants knowing it's an experiment, it will probably not show the real behavior. So, in a way, like a lot of the things that we want to do, especially when it comes to like governance and finance, like, framing it as an experiment is gonna make it a bit obsolete. But that's a counter take.
I think it's also tools. Right now, when you want to run one of these experiments, it's very, very complicated and cumbersome, and you have to invest a lot. Right? In a world where you could just spin out an instance of your DAO and that has some governance model, and you use that to make one decision, and then you can decide whether you stick with that or not, I think we'll see a lot more experimentation. Thankfully, everyone and their dog is building down tools, but yeah, I think that'll make it.
Yeah, so we've been experimenting a lot. So with the new framework, Council Protocol, we talked about the voting vaults. Another thing that I didn't mention is we actually have this voting vault. I'll just show this real quick, where you don't have to pick between yield and being involved in governance. So you can, if you basically go into compound position or an Aave position, you get a C token or A token, you can stake that in governance and still get a vote. And so a huge voter participation issue, right? Like if Charles, I talk to him about this all the time from Maker, and Ruin, encountered this as well over there, is when there's a major vote, they sometimes have to pull out collateral to like actually go vote, and then they put that collateral back in, and it can be a pain. So if you can get, the best of both worlds, it's cool. And so I'm really interested to see like people experiment and try new voting vaults and define what constitutes a vote. But one thing that we tried, which is cool, is we launched an NFT project, and this is called the Elfiverse. And so we did a certain amount, and it's 10,000 total supply. We gave it to people who delegated in our system. So if they delegated or they self-delegated, we gave them the ability to mint this NFT. And sort of the premise of this, and it's called the Elfiverse, they're these pixelated elves, they look really cool. And sort of the premise of this is, you know, I'm very much a believer that NFTs and DAOs are extremely complementary because you can build reputational aspects around NFTs. You can also use NFTs to essentially build community, right? Like one of the cool things we see currently in this market is these NFT projects build amazing community, right? There's people feel connected to their JPEG, to this community. They throw events together. And it's really powerful for that. And so when you combine that with a DAO that's actually, you know, building you know, really cool financial primitives or other things like that, I believe that you can supercharge that and you can use that in a really cool way. And so one of the things that we did with this launch is to say, hey, we're releasing this. We're going to give, you know, 2,500 of these to the DAO. So they can release them however they want. We gave them to people who used our protocol, who delegated, and now like we're super curious to see how this can be experimented and how these two worlds can merge. And we have a ton of ideas. I want to see really cool proposals go through governance. I'll give